Linda Slaten was born in 1950 in the state of Alabama, USA. She had loving parents and a younger sister named Judy. From an early age, Linda was ambitious and kind-hearted. She always tried to help others, which earned her many friends. Later, she married a man named Frank, with whom she had 2 sons, Jeff and Tim. However, as the years went by, their marriage became increasingly problematic. Frank developed an alcohol addiction and started to abuse his wife and children. Eventually, Linda left and decided to move to Florida with her sons. They settled in the city of Lakeland, where Linda's parents and sister already lived. Linda rented a house in a residential complex by the lake and dedicated all her time to providing for her sons. Linda took various jobs, but money was always tight for her. Sometimes she had to sell her belongings to pay the bills. She couldn't even afford a car, so her elder son, Jeff, had to ride his bicycle to school. Her younger son, Tim, played on a football team, and often he had to ask his coach for a ride home after practice to avoid walking. Despite the financial difficulties, Linda always strived to give her sons the most time and attention she could. She took them on hikes, brought them to concerts of their favorite bands, and overall tried to ensure their childhood was filled with positive moments. On the evening of September 3, 1981, when Linda was 31 years old, she waited for Tim to finish his practice and went with him to the neighbors who were hosting a small family gathering. Meanwhile, Jeff arrived home and wanted to have dinner, but there was hardly any food in the fridge. He got angry at his mother, hopped on his bicycle, and rode to his grandparents' house, who lived on the other side of the city. Later, when the whole family returned home, Jeff argued with his mother about the empty fridge, but eventually they wished each other a good night and went to bed. The next morning, Linda's sister, who lived in the same complex, went to her house to invite her for a cup of coffee. She knocked on the door but received no response. Thinking that Linda had gone somewhere, the woman turned around and was about to leave when she noticed that the bedroom window was open. She approached it, looked inside, and saw Linda lying across the bed. In the next second, the woman screamed and ran to the neighbors to call the police. One look at her sister's face was enough for her to realize that she was dead. Detectives arrived at their house and began examining the crime scene. Linda was lying on her bed, her clothing partially pulled down with a wire hanger around her neck. Based on this evidence, the police suspected that an unknown man had entered the victim's room, assaulted her, and strangled her. Soon, forensic experts confirmed this theory by finding a palm print on the windowsill. Linda often left it open since there was no air conditioning in the apartment, making it easy for the killer to gain access. While the detectives worked at the crime scene, the eldest son of the victim woke up from all the commotion. The investigators took him outside and delivered the tragic news of his mother's death. Afterward, they woke up his younger brother and led him towards the exit. However, at that very moment, as the boy passed by his mother's room, another police officer emerged from it, and through the open door, Tim saw his mother's body and froze in place until the officer pulled him away. Jeff and Tim, aged 15 and 12 at the time, were in deep shock. Initially, they simply couldn't believe that their mother was dead. Later, the investigators managed to talk to them, and the brothers stated that they hadn't heard any noise and hadn't even woken up that night. Despite having their own rooms, the detectives found this strange. Considering the building had very good acoustics, and given the brutal nature of the murder, loud noises should have been audible from the victim's room. The police interviewed the neighbors, who also hadn't heard anything. None of the residents in the complex had seen any suspicious individuals that day. Medical experts examined the victim's body and confirmed that she had been subjected to violence. They extracted the killer's biological material, but at that time, they couldn't conduct DNA analysis. The experts also confirmed that Linda died as a result of strangulation. Thus, the detectives had to investigate the case with almost no evidence. The palm print could only help them if they managed to find a suspect and make a comparison. Linda's sons moved in with their grandparents. They remained in a state of shock and constantly feared that the unknown killer would come after them. The fear was so intense that they slept in the same room as their grandmother, while their grandfather sat in the living room with a rifle. However, the detectives believed that the children were not in danger. In their opinion, the crime had solely a sexual motive and the killer must have known the victim. After speaking with Linda's relatives, they learned about her ex-husband, who had a history of domestic violence. He immediately became the prime suspect, but the police quickly determined that the man was in a different state at the time of the murder. Afterward, the investigators discovered that shortly before her death, Linda had started dating a certain man. They located this person, but he also had a solid alibi. The detectives checked all the victim's neighbors, comparing their fingerprints with the sample found on the windowsill. They then conducted a similar comparison with all previously convicted men residing in Lakeland, but they couldn't find any matches. Several weeks after the murder, Linda's sons gradually started to recover, and eventually, the relatives decided that the best option for them would be to return to school. Over time, it did help the brothers as they began interacting with friends again and gradually returned to a normal life. Tim rejoined the football team as his mother had always been proud of his accomplishments in the sport. A month after her death, he hung a photograph of his team in his bedroom as a reminder of how his mother had taught him to move forward and achieve his goals. Meanwhile, the detectives reached a dead end, failing to find a suitable suspect. They decided to go back to the beginning and reconsider why the sons hadn't heard any screams or signs of a struggle. The police reviewed Jeff's statements and noticed that he had an argument with Linda on the day of her murder. Furthermore, the teenager himself mentioned that he and his mother frequently engaged in verbal disputes. This made the detectives ponder. Could Jeff have killed his mother? They called him in for questioning and started asking various questions again. Soon, Jeff realized that the investigators suspected him of the crime. He denied his involvement, but the detectives continued to pressure him. They offered Jeff to undergo a polygraph test, and he agreed. The polygraph operator did not detect any signs of deception, but the police were not ready to give up. Soon after, they called him in for questioning again and even planned to bring in a hypnotist to put him in a trance state. Jeff constantly faced pressure, and one of the investigators directly accused him of strangling his mother. This led to the breaking point for Linda's relatives, and they demanded that the police focus on finding the real killer and prohibited them from approaching Jeff. Despite this, Jeff agreed to undergo another polygraph test, and after successful results, he was finally no longer considered a suspect. From that point on, the case remained stagnant for many years. Jeff and Tim grew up, got jobs, and started their own families. The murder of their mother still haunted them, but every time they contacted the investigators, they received the same response. No progress had been made in the case. In March 1999, experts extracted a DNA sample from the biological material found on the victim's body. 2 years later, a new detective assigned to the case compared it with samples from all the suspects, including Linda's two sons, but there were no matches. Even comparing it with the FBI database yielded no results. When Jeff met with this detective, he realized that they had been acquainted for many years. It turned out that the men regularly played bowling together with mutual friends. They talked, and the investigator promised Jeff that he would solve the case no matter what. Around the same time, Tim and Jeff heard about another unsolved crime that had remained unresolved for many years. After it received widespread media attention, new evidence emerged, leading to the capture of the perpetrator. That's when the brothers decided to approach journalists and share their family tragedy. They gave a detailed interview, and the story made it into the local newspapers. In September 2001, the detective received an interesting lead. He learned that a man named Jimmy Ulmer had abducted a young woman through her bedroom window a year after Linda's murder, for which he received an 80-year prison sentence. What made it even more intriguing was that during Linda's murder, this person lived in the same residential complex just a few meters away from her house. At the time of Ulmer's arrest, the DNA of criminals was not yet entered into a common database since it simply did not exist. The man himself passed away in '96, and there were no remaining biological samples. However, the detective contacted the perpetrator's mother, who provided several personal belongings from which the experts managed to extract a sample. Unfortunately, it did not match the DNA of the killer. But despite the setback, the detective was not ready to give up. He continued to search for new suspects, consistently asked the FBI to run the DNA sample of the killer through all available databases, and stayed in touch with Linda's sons. Unfortunately, in 2015, he encountered health problems that forced him to retire, despite his promise to see the case through to the end. At that point, Jeff and Tim had almost resigned themselves to the thought that they would never find their mother's killer. However, in 2019, a new hope emerged when C.C. Moore, a renowned expert in genetic genealogy, took on the case. She took the DNA sample of the killer and uploaded it to public databases, then began searching for any matches. Typically, such databases can even help find the most distant relatives of the DNA owner, who could be living in different parts of the world without the slightest knowledge of each other's existence. With this information, it is possible to trace their family tree, find common lines, filter out thousands of relatives, and identify the DNA owner. After conducting all this extensive work, Moore was able to pinpoint one family living in the area at the time of the murder. Within that family, there was only one person who fit all the parameters, leading her to conclude that he was highly likely to be the killer. When the detectives heard his name, they immediately realized they had come across him in old reports. His name was Joseph Clinton Mills, Tim's football coach, who regularly gave him a ride home from practice. He had never been on the list of suspects, but back in 1981, the police had taken a statement over the phone as he had dropped Tim off at home on that same day. None of the detectives even considered the possibility that Mills could be the killer. At that time, he was only 20 years old, and there was absolutely no evidence against him. So the police didn't compare his DNA and fingerprints with the samples found at the crime scene. The investigators decided to hold off on informing Jeff and Tim about this discovery. First, they needed to make sure that Mills was truly behind their mother's murder. After studying his biography, they found out that in 1984, Mills was arrested for forgery of a will, and his fingerprints were taken, which are still kept in a paper archive to this day. Experts compared them with the fingerprints found on the victim's windowsill and obtained a perfect match. After 38 years, they finally learned the identity of the probable killer. Immediately after this revelation, the detectives moved on to the final step, obtaining a DNA sample from Mills to compare it with the biological material from the victim's body. They discovered that the man still lived in the same house as in 1981. Mills was now 58 years old, owned a small business, was married, and had children and grandchildren. The detectives monitored him for several weeks, hoping to obtain some item with his DNA. It could have been a cigarette butt, a coffee cup, a bottle, and so on. However, they never had the opportunity, so the police decided to discreetly retrieve his trash. They handed the bag to the laboratory, where experts tried to find an item with his DNA, and soon they succeeded. The results were not long in coming. Mills' DNA matched completely with the sample found on Linda's body. Afterward, the detectives met with her sons to inform them of the progress in the case. They were both shocked, but Tim had a much harder time accepting it. He couldn't believe that his football coach turned out to be the same monster who had killed his mother. Tim respected him and looked up to him, and what's more, Mills continued to give him rides home from practice even after the murder. The man constantly encouraged him and always asked if there were any developments in his mother's case. For all these years, a photo of his football team hung in Tim's old bedroom with the monster who killed his mom standing right behind him. In the same year, Mills was arrested. He remained calm and didn't even ask what he was being accused of. When brought in for questioning and asked about Linda's murder, he claimed to have no involvement. According to him, he dropped off Tim and left. Mills insisted that he never entered their house, but the detectives knew it was a lie. They informed him about the DNA and fingerprint match, after which the suspect suddenly changed his version of events. Now, Mills insisted that on that night, Linda herself invited him to sneak into her bedroom through the window for an intimate encounter. Then she asked him to lightly choke her with a hanger, but Mills miscalculated his strength and ended up killing her. Of course, the detectives didn't believe this story for a second, considering all the existing evidence. They had a much more plausible theory. Based on the fact that Mills had repeatedly given Tim rides home, he had seen his mother and could have targeted her as a victim. On the evening of the murder, he dropped off the boy, who immediately went to a party at the neighbor's house with his mother. Mills took advantage of the fact that no one would be home in their house. He drove away for some distance and then returned on foot, sneaking into Linda's bedroom through the window and hiding in the closet. He spent several hours there, waiting for everyone to go to sleep. In that same closet, he took a wire hanger and used it as a murder weapon. After subjecting the victim to violence, he left the house through the window. Based on all the available evidence, charges were brought against Mills for the murder, and the case was handed over to court. In the state of Florida, the death penalty was a possible sentence for such a crime. And on February 9, 2022, Mills decided to make a deal with the prosecution to avoid this fate. He confessed to the murder, but under the conditions of the agreement, he was not required to disclose the details of the crime. Linda's sons were unhappy with this fact. In the courtroom, Tim shouted at his coach, demanding to know why he took his mother away from him. But the man remained silent, looking down. Only when given the opportunity for a final statement, Mills said, "I'm a good person. I'm not who they're trying to portray me as." This angered the brothers even more, but ultimately, they were grateful to the investigators for bringing the case to a conclusion and finally finding the killer. Mills was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the verdict was delivered, Jeff and Tim promised to try to live honorable lives and dedicate themselves to their families, as that is what their mother would have wanted. Samantha Koenig was born August 30th, 1993 in Anchorage, Alaska. The state's largest population center is characterized by a quiet, measured lifestyle, a harsh climate, and vast expanses surrounded by snow-capped mountains. The girl loved animals very much, so after school she planned to find a job related to them. Another option for her was a career as a doctor. Samantha even considered applying to the Navy as a nurse. In her spare time, she worked part-time at a Subway restaurant and a Harley-Davidson dealership. In early 2012, when she was 18, she found another part-time job at a small chain coffee shop downtown. Samantha was excited about the opportunity. First of all, the job was easy enough. Secondly, she had to be alone on her shift, so the whole work process depended solely on her. Her boyfriend, however, did not share this enthusiasm. He was worried about Samantha having to work through the night alone and tried to talk her out of it. But eventually, he supported her decision on the condition that he would pick her up after each shift. She assured him that the coffee shop was full of cameras and even had a panic button to call the police. Even though the coffee shop was in the middle of nowhere, it was a fairly deserted area, like most of Anchorage. The city has low population density, so even in the downtown area, you can see empty streets. Also, the daylight hours are short in winter in Alaska, so Samantha had to work a lot during the hours of darkness. Samantha fell in love with the job and quickly got the hang of it. By early February, she had already worked there for a month, and on the first of the month, she was getting ready to finish her shift at 8 p.m. as usual. A customer came out 5 minutes before the coffee shop closed and ordered a large Americano. Samantha prepared the drink and turned to the window to give it to the customer. He took the glass and immediately pointed a gun at the young woman. An unidentified man in a ski mask stated that he was going to rob her and demanded that the lights in the coffee shop be turned off. Samantha complied, and the offender immediately broke in through the window. A surveillance camera caught the whole thing, but those silent witnesses could not help her. Frightened by the armed robber, she also did not press the panic button. Once inside the coffee shop, the perpetrator tied Samantha up and asked where her car was parked. The young woman replied that she didn't have one and added that her boyfriend would be here any minute to pick her up. The man then took her outside and headed for his car. While he was looking around, Samantha managed to break free and ran, but the perpetrator quickly caught up with her and grabbed her. Unfortunately, there was not a soul on the street at the time, so no one could help her. The man said that if she tried to run away again, he would kill her. He then led the young woman across the street to his pickup truck and put her in the passenger seat. The perpetrator had obviously prepared in advance, since the license plates had been taken off the car. As he drove her to an unknown destination, the man stated that he only wanted a ransom from her family and that Samantha could then go home. He still did not show her his face, which was concealed by a ski mask. All along the way, the young woman tried to convince him to let her go and told him that her family didn't have much money, but the kidnapper wouldn't listen. At one point, he asked Samantha where her phone was. The young woman replied that she had left it in a coffee shop, and this enraged the perpetrator. He needed the phone for his ransom plan. So he went back to the coffee shop to get the smartphone and sent 2 messages from it to Samantha's boss and to her boyfriend. In them, the kidnapper wrote on the young woman's behalf that she was tired and would go out of town with friends for a few days. All the while, Samantha was in his pickup truck. After texting, the kidnapper removed the battery from the phone and got behind the wheel again. He drove the young woman to an undisclosed location that looked like a barn and told her to sit quietly. The man stated that if she tried to scream, he would kill her. He also added that he had a police scanner, and if she somehow managed to call for help, he would know right away. The perpetrator demanded Samantha's credit card, but things were not so simple here. The young woman said she shared a bank account with her boyfriend, and the card was in his possession. So the man decided to steal it. Having first learned the boyfriend's address and PIN number, he left the tied-up Samantha alone and went to get the card. The young woman told him it was always in the guy's car. Once there, the perpetrator saw the right car and started breaking it open. At that very moment, the guy spotted it from the window and rushed outside, but he was too late. The kidnapper took out the card and quickly fled. On the way back, he stopped at an ATM to check the PIN number, then returned to Samantha's house. Meanwhile, the young woman's relatives and boyfriend were in a panic. The guy didn't believe for a second that the message was written to her, and everyone understood that something bad had happened to Samantha. But at that moment, none of them connected the theft of the credit card with the disappearance of the young woman. The guy didn't even think the events could be connected in any way. By nightfall, Samantha's family contacted the police and they began a search. Of course, the first thing they did was to look through the camera footage in the coffee shop and immediately witnessed her abduction. Soon the FBI got involved, but they could not find any serious leads. The perpetrator had clearly prepared carefully for the kidnapping. Not a single detail that could be used to identify him was caught on camera. Meanwhile, the young woman's relatives, with the help of concerned people, raised the $41,000 they had promised for information on Samantha's whereabouts. The parents were constantly being interviewed by local TV stations, begging for any information about their daughter's fate. Flyers with Samantha's picture and information about the reward appeared all over Anchorage, but the police never received a single valuable witness. As the days passed, detectives desperate for answers began checking everyone Samantha knew, including her boyfriend and relatives, but they quickly determined that none of them had anything to do with the kidnapping. Nearly a month passed. On February 24, Samantha's boyfriend received a new message from her number saying, "Connor, park sign, under Albert's picture. Isn't she cute?" Investigators immediately realized it was about the local Connor's dog park and, along with the young woman's relatives, headed there. After a while, they saw what the kidnapper meant. There was a booth in the park with various flyers, among which was a photo of a dead dog named Albert. The owners placed this flyer on the stand to say goodbye to their pet, but the detectives noticed a plastic bag underneath it. When they opened it, they saw a Polaroid photo of Samantha in the background with a newspaper from February 13 and a letter written on a typewriter in which the kidnapper demanded that $30,000 be deposited in her bank account. He promised to kill the young woman if these conditions were not met. The police and the FBI immediately devised a plan that could help them catch this thoughtful criminal. They told the young woman's father to top up the card in installments so that the kidnapper would have to repeatedly go to the ATMs. He did just that. First, the man deposited $5,000, and a few hours later, that money was withdrawn from one of the Anchorage ATMs. The kidnapper was caught on camera, but even here, the detectives were unsuccessful. The man was wearing a hat, a hood, glasses, and what appeared to be a false beard and mustache. It was impossible to identify him from the photograph. The police immediately arrived at the ATM, but the perpetrator had already fled. A week later, the thief withdrew another batch of money in Willcox, Arizona, the opposite end of the United States. He traveled 6,000 miles to throw off investigators, but they continued to monitor his activities. The next cash withdrawal occurred in Lordsburg, New Mexico, just an hour away from Arizona. Following that, he made 2 more withdrawals in different cities in Texas. In the meantime, police carefully examined ATM photos. They soon realized that the criminal had made a huge mistake in Willcox. He had left his car in the camera's line of sight, so the detectives now knew the model of his car. Of course, it was impossible to make out the license plates in such a picture, but now they had something to work with. Investigators feared the kidnapper might cross the border into Mexico, so all patrols were instructed to stop white Ford Focuses. A few days later, on March 13, a Texas Highway Patrol spotted a vehicle of that make in a hotel parking lot. There was a man sitting behind the wheel. The officer decided to wait for him to pull up and follow him. Soon the man drove out of the parking lot and along the highway. As soon as the driver exceeded the allowable speed limit of 3 miles, the patrolman ordered him to pull over at the curb. This was done to put the suspect's vigilance to sleep. If a dangerous criminal is behind the wheel, he may be armed and ready to fight back to the last man. So the patrolman pretended that the reason for the stop was a minor infraction. The driver of the white Ford turned out to be 34-year-old Israel Keys of Anchorage. The policeman was immediately alerted and decided to search his car, calling for backup in the process. Samantha's cell phone and her boyfriend's bank card were found in the car. They also found a gun, a false mustache, a beard, and dark glasses. Police had no doubt that he was behind Samantha's kidnapping, but they were still shocked because Keys had never come to their attention. The man had a perfectly clean criminal history. He lived with his girlfriend and 10-year-old daughter and ran his small construction business successfully. He was respected and trusted among his acquaintances. Even some members of the Anchorage prosecutor's office used his repair and construction services. But one question preoccupied everyone. Where was Samantha Gainey? Under questioning, Keys was extremely calm. He joked and laughed a lot. The FBI agents kept up the dialogue in his style, and after a while, he confessed what he had done. Keys stated that he had been planning to rob this coffee shop for several days. He did not know in advance if he would kidnap the employee. Moreover, he had worked out 2 rules which he himself broke: never look for victims near his own home and never transport them in his car. All of this made him hesitant as he stood in front of Samantha in a dark coffee shop. But he made the decision to act to the end. On the night of the kidnapping, he drove her to the shed in the backyard of his house, where his daughter and girlfriend were at the time. The perpetrator turned on the radio in case his victim tried to scream, and left to get the bank card. When he returned, Israel quietly entered the house, trying not to wake his family, poured himself a glass of wine, and went into the barn. There, he abused Samantha and killed her. But what about this photo they found in the park? It had the February 13th issue of the newspaper from 2 weeks after the kidnapping, and Samantha appeared to be alive. But in fact, she had been dead all along, and there is no manipulation in the photo. Keys fixed her eyelids so that her eyes were open and applied makeup to her face. According to a detective who attended the interrogation, Israel recounted the details of the murder with such ease as if he were listing the foods he had eaten for breakfast. The perpetrator agreed to tell it all on the condition that the confession portion of the interrogation not be published. He did not want his daughter to hear it all. In doing so, he killed Samantha only a few dozen yards from her bedroom. The detectives already thought Key's story was nearing its end, but that was only the beginning. The morning after the murder, Israel and his family went on a sea cruise from the city of New Orleans. Tickets for it had been purchased in advance, and the perpetrator was well aware that he was committing this murder just hours before departure. Accordingly, he had to leave the body somewhere so that no one would discover it. Keys did the simple thing and left it in the same barn. It was freezing outside, so the body quickly froze. When Keys returned home 2 weeks later, he took a picture with a newspaper and used a typewriter to write a ransom letter. He then separated the body into pieces and went to a small lake 40 minutes outside Anchorage. Using a chainsaw, he made holes in the ice where he placed bags of the body parts and additional weights. After all that, the maniac went winter fishing. It took police divers 10 hours to retrieve those bags from the bottom. Detectives also learned that during his trips between ATMs across the states, Keys used a rental car, the same white Ford Focus. At one point, he had a malfunction and went to one of the dealerships to have the car changed. Surprisingly, that moment played a key role in catching the culprit. The car was caught on ATM camera before the breakdown, and all the police were looking for that particular model. The dealership gave him the same white Focus because they had no other suitable cars at the time. Had the situation been different, he would never have been stopped. In the end, during questioning, Keys confirmed what the investigators had already guessed. Samantha was not his first victim. The perpetrator had promised to tell them about all the crimes he had committed in exchange for 2 conditions. First, he wanted a guaranteed death sentence and demanded that it be carried out within a year of being pronounced. Second, he asked that everything he said be kept secret from the press. These conditions surprised the detectives, but they saw no reason to refuse, and the maniac began to tell them horror stories. Israel began committing crimes at an early age. He would break into other people's houses, steal, set fires in the woods, and torture animals. His parents were deep believers, but they practiced a very questionable and unpopular branch of Christianity. Because of his parents' constantly shifting religious preferences, they regularly moved around the country. At the age of 20, Keyes joined the Army, where he spent 3 years. A few months before that, he had molested a random young woman after spotting her in an Oregon park. When questioned, Israel said he wanted to get out of the Army as soon as possible so he could start killing. After quitting at age 23, he began his killing streak. Keyes made weapons caches in the woods so he could go there at any time and start looking for victims. Police found 2 such caches in Anchorage and New York. Inside were money, knives, gun, and body disposal supplies. Over the next few years, he regularly went out hunting in different states, but the exact number of his victims is still unknown. The FBI has only been able to pinpoint 5 of them. But detectives believe Keyes committed at least 11 murders, and these are just the cases where many factors point to his involvement. In total, the number of murders could be as many as 30. In addition, Israel had been robbing banks, stores, and private homes so that he always had enough money to buy weapons and travel. In his hiding places, discovered after interrogations, he was found to have considerable cash reserves. Despite all this, the man has never come to the attention of the police, except on one occasion. In all interrogations, he denied his involvement, but detectives did not believe him. On March 3, 1996, a 12-year-old girl named Julie Harris disappeared. Israel Keyes, who was 16 at the time, lived in the same neighborhood. Police suspected him after a witness found Julie near Keyes shortly before her disappearance. It was not until a year later that the girl's remains were found in the river, and her killer was never caught. During interrogations after Samantha's murder, Keyes denied his involvement, but investigators were again reluctant to take his word for it. They did not, however, have any direct evidence. In a conversation with FBI agents, Israel admitted that he had studied serial killers since he was a child. His idol was Ted Bundy, and the maniac wanted to be like him. He felt no remorse for his victims and happily recounted how he managed to lead 2 completely different lives. On the one hand, he was a decent family man and businessman, and on the other, he was an inhuman killer. The only thing that gave any hint of feeling was that Keyes had asked the detectives to keep the details of his crimes from his daughter. He also stated that he had never killed children or anyone who had, again because of his own daughter. The FBI agents did not believe this, but they could not prove otherwise. They were all forced to admit that Israel was an extremely thoughtful maniac who had made only one mistake in his entire series of crimes. The investigators hoped that he would tell them all of his atrocities himself, but that never happened. 9 months after his arrest, Keyes took his own life in his cell. Even though FBI agents had spent hundreds of hours interrogating him up to that point, much he had withheld from them. 11 drawings depicting skulls were found under the bed in his cell. It is possible that each one symbolized a victim. The picture of these drawings were not published until 2020. Thus, Israel Keyes can be considered one of the most violent and elaborate maniacs. He managed to maintain an impeccable reputation, committing dozens of different crimes, always getting away with it. If he hadn't left his car in camera view, he might never have been caught. Investigators had no doubt that if he had, he would have continued to kill. Keyes himself said he saw killing as his purpose in life and planned to continue hunting people until he was caught. Marie Collins, residing in the city of Perth, Western Australia, was a respected elderly woman in the community. She was highly regarded among the local church community, of which she was an active participant. Marie was known for her kindness and responsiveness, always ready to help those in need. An elegant woman with refined taste and a keen understanding of fashion trends, she also worked part-time at a nearby clothing store. Marie lived in her own apartment, consisting of 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, with a beautiful balcony view. The apartment was located in the prestigious Washington Gardens area on Leonard Street, southeast of downtown Perth. Unfortunately, Marie's husband passed away in 2001 when he was still quite young, leaving her childless. Despite this, she led a very active life, and her home was a welcoming place for her numerous friends and relatives. In 2020, Marie decided to renovate her residence, demonstrating her proficiency in new technologies and being well acquainted with various gadgets and computers. She regularly communicated with friends and family through social media. Therefore, they became deeply concerned when, on Easter Sunday, April 12, 2020, they received no messages from her. Attempts to contact her by phone went unanswered. The day before, on Saturday, April 11th, Marie had coffee at a cafe near her home, visited the beach, and saw her sister Helen Batheine. She returned home around noon and sent a message with peculiar content. "Hello, Helen. Sorry for not answering your call. I'm not feeling well and I've lost my voice." After 1 p.m., she ceased all communication. Losing contact with her sister, Helen Batheine, who was concerned about her silence, called her brother Wayne Johnson, who lived just a few blocks away from Marie with his 12-year-old son and could visit his sister to find out what was going on. Worried, Wayne texted Marie and also received no response. He told Helen that he was heading to Marie's place and would stay in constant communication, but after a while, he too stopped answering phone calls and SMS. Growing even more alarmed, Helen decided to go to her sister's apartment, asking her son-in-law to accompany her. When they approached the residential complex, they saw Marie in Wayne's cars in the parking lot, a troubling sign. Meeting Marie's neighbor and sharing their concerns and suspicions, all 3 went to the woman's apartment. Helen had a spare key to her sister's apartment, and all 3 easily entered. However, when they crossed the threshold, a horrifying scene unfolded before them. The apartment was drenched in blood, knives, latex gloves, a large piece of tarpaulin, beer bottles, and protein shake containers were scattered around. Most importantly, they saw the lifeless bodies of Marie and Wayne lying on the floor. In a state of shock, all 3 immediately left the apartment and called the police, who arrived promptly and began the investigation. Upon examining the apartment, investigators confirmed that Marie and Wayne had been subjected to a very brutal attack. Bloody shoe prints were found all over the floor, and the broken and scattered furniture throughout the apartment indicated that the victims had resisted their assailant. A thorough inspection revealed that the likely weapons used in the bloody massacre were 2 sets of handcuffs, a stun gun, a bread knife, a large hunting knife, and a letter opener. Medical experts determined that Marie had suffered 12 knife wounds and a throat cut, while Wayne had 25 knife wounds and at least 10 stab wounds. Additionally, on the handle of the bloodied stun gun, DNA belonging to both Marie Collins and the presumed murderer was found. Commencing the investigation on hot leads, the police discovered that there were no signs of forced entry into the apartment. Given that the apartment was on the 8th floor, the theory of the perpetrator entering through a window seemed unlikely. Detectives formulated 2 hypotheses regarding the killer's entry into the residence. Either the perpetrator had their own key, or Marie was acquainted with the individual and trusted them enough to let them into the apartment. Investigators began questioning Marie's friends and relatives to determine their whereabouts at the time of the crime. They also interviewed neighbors who lived nearby. The police conducted a thorough inspection of the surrounding area and the parking lot, jotting down the license plate numbers of parked cars and peering inside through windows. In one of the vehicles, a receipt from a local hardware store issued on Saturday, April 11th at 1843 was discovered. The receipt listed items such as blue tarpaulin and rope. Checking the car's registration number against the database, investigators identified the owner as 29-year-old Luke Fawcett, who resided in the same building as the attack's victims. In Luke Fawcett's police record, data on 2 convictions for possession of controlled substances and several traffic violations were found, but nothing more. Suspecting Luke Fawcett's involvement in the crime, detectives began surveillance and learned that on the day of Marie and Wayne's murder, Luke sought medical assistance at a hospital. His grandmother had driven him there after he informed her that he had injured himself with a knife while falling down a staircase. The police invited Luke to the station for questioning, where he denied any involvement in the crime and willingly provided a DNA sample. At this stage, investigators lacked sufficient grounds for the suspect's arrest, so they continued their search for evidence. Police reviewed surveillance camera footage at the hardware store, discovering that on Saturday evening, April 11th, around 20:43, Luke appeared on camera purchasing rope and blue tarpaulin. Additionally, one of the neighbors confirmed seeing a man behaving suspiciously near his apartment on that day, walking back and forth in the corridor, crying, sighing, and the neighbor took a photo of him, revealing Luke. DNA samples from the suspect were soon obtained, and they matched the blood traces in Marie's apartment. This crucial evidence led to Luke's official arrest on April 13, 2020, for the murders of Marie Collins and Wayne Johnson. Continuing their investigation, the police found out that Luke Fawcett was a reserved boy in his childhood with very few friends. Despite this, he managed to graduate from school with one of the top results in his class and enrolled at the University of Western Australia, where he studied psychology. He juggled his studies while working part-time at a nightclub. On the surface, Luke made a very positive impression. He appeared to be a successful and friendly young man. After completing his education, Luke began working in a disability support service. He also had a girlfriend, and they were planning to move in together. Luke's career was on an upward trajectory. He rapidly climbed the professional ladder, earning trust and respect from those around him. He had every chance to defend his degree in psychology. For several years, Luke rented a one-bedroom apartment in the same building where Marie Collins lived, and they had developed good neighborly relations. He occasionally visited her, helped with household chores, rearranged furniture in the apartment, and taught her computer skills. However, at the beginning of 2020, several unpleasant incidents occurred in Luke's life that seriously impacted the course of events. It all began with Luke experiencing frequent panic attacks, losing satisfaction from his work, and being diagnosed with anxiety disorder and depression. His behavior became increasingly strange. After quarreling with colleagues at work, he resigned, leading to a complete breakdown in his relationship with his girlfriend. Faced with ongoing health and relationship issues, Luke turned to alcohol and illicit substances, combining them with antidepressant medication. Losing his steady income, he began facing financial difficulties, stopped paying for accommodation, and was at risk of being evicted from his apartment. After obtaining a search warrant for Luke Fawcett's apartment and car, as well as seizing his phone, the police continued their investigation, and what they found there left everyone in shock. It turned out that Marie's murder was not a random act. Luke had been planning it for a long time. 2 handwritten notes, both authored by Fawcett, were discovered in the apartment. One was labeled as a to-do list detailing what and how he should execute, and the other was titled Equipment, listing items required for the crime, such as silent shoes, a baseball bat, cable ties, pepper spray, a stun gun, and handcuffs. Investigators also found that a week before the murder, the young man had purchased a shovel at the same hardware store. In the confiscated mobile phone, a video recorded approximately 2 weeks earlier was found, showing Luke Fawcett dressed in a black suit and mask, holding a knife in one hand and a stun gun in the other, seemingly rehearsing the impending murder. Files with recordings made during the actual murder were also discovered on the phone, with names like interrogation, beating, pepper spray to the eyes, etc. Additionally, a screenshot of a map was found, leading the police to a forest approximately 200 kilometers south of Perth, where a freshly dug grave was discovered. Luke had prepared it in advance for his victim, along with a shovel and a black bag containing the same protein shake bottles found in Marie Collins's apartment. During the court proceedings, Fawcett denied his involvement in his neighbor's death and claimed he found her body wrapped in blue tarpaulin at her home. He asserted that an unknown man, who also attacked him, was the real killer. However, he admitted to stabbing Wayne Johnson, alleging self-defense, as Wayne attacked him after seeing his sister's lifeless body, mistakenly believing that Luke was the perpetrator and began choking him. He explained his shoulder injury, sustained during their altercation, through this confrontation with Wayne Johnson. Fawcett told the court that he hesitated to call the police because he feared nobody would believe him. "I was afraid that I would be blamed for the deaths of both these people," he said. Regarding the video found on his phone, Luke claimed it was part of a role-playing video game, and the threatening videos and shopping lists were unrelated to the murder that occurred in his neighbor's apartment. The prosecution, however, was adamant, asserting that it was Luke Fawcett who, in the second half of the day on Saturday, April 11, 2020, entered Marie's apartment, shocked her with a stun gun, and inflicted more than 12 knife wounds on her. At the time when the woman was already dead, the young man, taking advantage of her apartment, calmly took a shower, drank beer and a protein cocktail, started messaging a woman he recently met, sending her photos from the apartment, boasting that he lives in a luxurious flat he recently acquired. He then went to the hardware store, where he bought tarpaulin and rope, and upon returning to the apartment, continued drinking beer and cocktails throughout the night. When Wayne entered his sister's apartment the next morning and saw Luke and what he had done, a brutal fight ensued between the men, which ended as tragically for Wayne as it did for his sister. As a result of this altercation, Wayne Johnson suffered 25 knife wounds, including in the head, chest, and abdomen. Realizing that Luke had received several knife wounds and a dislocated collarbone during the fight, Wayne asked his grandmother to take him to the hospital, lying about the circumstances leading to the injury. While Luke stood in the corridor, calling his grandmother, and then waited for her, crying and mumbling in pain, a neighbor took a photo of the suspicious guy. Prosecutor Justin Wally presented evidence that Luke, proficient in computers, attempted to access Marie's bank accounts through her computer while in the apartment, and this, along with the desire to take possession of her flat, served as the motive for the murder. Wayne Johnson, on the other hand, became a random victim as he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, merely intending to visit his sister. Forensic psychiatric examination declared Luke Fawcett mentally competent, although his brazen and provocative behavior in the apartment, drinking beer and cocktails while Marie Collins lay dead on the floor wrapped in tarpaulin, remains inexplicable. In September 2021, the jury that rejected Luke Fawcett's claims found him guilty of the double murder of Marie Collins and Wayne Johnson after a 30-minute deliberation. Before sentencing, prosecutor Justin Wally stated that Fawcett displayed callous indifference at the highest level and the highest degree of depravity that defies adequate description. As a result, Fawcett was sentenced to 2 life terms with a minimum of 34 years before he becomes eligible for parole, potentially reaching the age of 61 by that time. After the trial, Helen Batina, the sister of the victims who discovered their bodies, read a statement on behalf of the family. The statement expressed that, despite justice prevailing, It wouldn't bring back their two loved ones and wouldn't erase the pain and suffering they endured since the Easter weekend of 2020. She also mentioned that the 22 months of investigation and court proceedings felt like the family's worst nightmare and would never end, as the empty chairs at the family table will always be a constant reminder of the absence of beloved family members and the nightmare they had to endure. In turn, Fawcett's grandparents, Heather and Philip Rogers, who were also present during the sentencing, stated that over the last 2 years, they rarely communicated with their grandson and had no idea where he had been and what he was doing. The heinous murder he committed shocked them, and they said, "What he did is just unbelievable. None of us can understand it." Despite this, we will support Luke because he still remains a member of our family. Michelle Young was born on February 17, 1977, in the small American town of Sayville, New York. From an early age, the girl was characterized by perseverance and determination. She set ambitious goals for herself and made every effort to achieve them. In school, she excelled academically and was captain of the cheerleading team. She also chose a career path quite early in life. Michelle planned to become a tax lawyer. To obtain the necessary education, Michelle enrolled at NC State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. She also joined the local cheerleading team, but later decided to leave it and fully focus on her studies. 4 years later, she earned a master's degree, and almost immediately after that, she got a job at a local accounting company. Despite the fact that Michelle had just started her career path, her position provided a decent income right from the start. She rented an apartment in a good area and devoted a large part of her time to climbing the career ladder. In February 2001, while celebrating her 24th birthday with friends, Michelle met a man named Jason. He was several years older and had graduated from the same university as her. The couple quickly found common ground, and soon they started dating. Jason worked as a sales agent in a large company that produced power tools. He lived in another city, and at the time of their meeting, he was in Raleigh on business. After meeting Michelle, he started visiting there more often, and at other times, they communicated by phone. Later, he permanently moved to the city, and after some time, he and Michelle started living together. 2 years later, Michelle became pregnant, and in August 2003, the couple decided to get married. On March 29, 2004, their daughter, Cassidy, was born, and the family moved into a large house located in a prestigious area on the outskirts of the city. Around the same time, Michelle's sister, Meredith, moved to Raleigh and regularly helped the family take care of the child. 2 years later, Michelle became pregnant again, and she and her husband decided to visit Jason's parents to celebrate the news. They lived in a city called Brevard, which was 400 kilometers away from their home. Unfortunately, instead of a celebration, the trip turned into a tragedy. On the very day the couple planned to return to Raleigh, Jason and Michelle were involved in a serious accident that caused her pregnancy to be terminated. The family was devastated by the news, but just 2 months later, Michelle became pregnant again. After a while, the couple found out that they were having a boy, and they eagerly awaited his birth. On November 2, 2006, Jason left for another city for work. As a sales agent, he regularly traveled around the country for business meetings and negotiations. This time, he was headed to a town called Clintwood, which was about 490 kilometers away. That day, Michelle invited her friend, Shelley, to visit. The women talked until evening, after which the friend went home. The next morning, Jason called his wife's sister, Meredith, and told her that before leaving for another city, he found some designer women's bags on an online store with a good discount and wanted to order one for Michelle as a gift for their 3rd anniversary. After his departure, he remembered that he had printed out several pages with these bags and left them on the table in his home office. Jason did not want his wife to see them and learn about the upcoming gift, so he asked her sister to go to their house and take them. Meredith agreed and came to their house at around 1 p.m. At that moment, she did not have the keys with her, and Michelle was supposed to be at work. But the woman knew that the door to their garage was broken and could be easily lifted by hand. She did just that, but immediately noticed something strange. Her sister's car was parked inside. Thinking that she had gone to work, Meredith walked into the house. Upon entering the kitchen, she saw Michelle's purse lying on the floor. The woman called her sister by name, but there was no answer. Instead, she heard their dog barking, which was also strange. When Jason and Michelle left the house, they always let the dog out into the backyard. Climbing upstairs, the woman noticed something red on the floor in the bedroom. Approaching closer, she realized with horror that it was a bloodstain, and next to it was her sister Michelle. She was lying face down. Meredith approached her sister and tried to turn her over, but immediately felt that her sister's body was cold. The woman panicked and immediately called 911. At the same time, Cassidy, the 2-year-old girl who was hiding under the bed next to where the body lay, crawled out and ran to her aunt when she saw her. Meredith called the police and led her outside, where they waited for the officers. When the woman was speaking to the operator, he asked, "Is the child okay?" Meredith examined her and found no visible injuries. The only thing she noticed was small bloodstains all over the room, which she immediately realized were the child's footprints. The child was immediately handed over to the doctors for examination, and the police began to investigate the crime scene. They immediately noticed something strange. There were bloody footprints of a child all over the room. However, Kennedy's feet were completely clean. Additionally, there wasn't a single drop of blood on the girl. The footprints led to the bathroom in only one direction. Bloodstains were found on the inside of the bathroom door, apparently left by the child's hand. Based on all of this, the detectives constructed the most obvious version of what had happened. After the murder, the girl was locked in the bathroom for a while, and then someone came in and washed Cassidy clean of blood. Later, when the police talked to Michelle's friend, they learned another interesting fact. Shelley said that they put the girl to sleep together the night before, and she was wearing a diaper. However, when the victim's sister came to her house, the child was not wearing a diaper. Based on this, the investigators concluded that the same person who washed the blood off the child also removed the diaper. The detectives did not find any signs of a break-in in the house. They discovered that Michelle's 2 rings, wedding and engagement, were missing from her hand, but all other valuables were in their place, including cash, ruling out the scenario of robbery. 2 small hairs that did not belong to the victim were found on her body and near her, and 4 DNA samples were found on the jewelry box that did not belong to Michelle or her husband. Several fingerprints were also found in the house that did not belong to anyone in their family. In the bedroom where the victim's body was found, experts discovered 2 shoe prints of American size 10 and 12, with the pattern on the soles. They were even able to determine the model of the shoes. Additionally, detectives noticed blood splatters on the door of the closet with clothing. However, the door was open and the splatters were arranged in a way that suggested the door should have been closed when they landed. On Jason's home office computer, the police found something interesting in the browsing history. Besides pages from a women's handbag store and a search for directions to Clintwood, there were several alarming search queries such as anatomy of a knockout, loss of consciousness from head trauma, and related topics. Medical experts concluded that Michelle died from a head injury inflicted by a heavy object. The perpetrator struck her over 30 times, and at the time of her death, she was 5 months pregnant and her baby did not survive the attack. The exact time of Michelle's death was not determined, but experts speculated that it most likely occurred at 5 or 6 in the morning. The brutality of the crime suggested that the perpetrator may have known the victim and harbored a strong dislike towards her. As usual, the detectives first looked into Michelle's husband. They spoke with her friends and relatives who provided them with a lot of interesting information. Their marriage was quite problematic as Jason and Michelle often argued over domestic issues. Furthermore, Jason was not happy when his wife became pregnant with their first child. He asked her to terminate the pregnancy, but Michelle refused. When Michelle became pregnant again after an accident they were involved in, Jason was once again not pleased with the news. It seemed like the couple might divorce in the foreseeable future. Meredith also told the police that Jason's request to retrieve the handbag printouts initially seemed strange to her, considering the obvious problems in their marriage, and it had already been over 3 weeks since their anniversary. However, one obvious fact contradicted the theories of Jason's involvement. At the time of the murder, he was in another city that was 490 kilometers away. After Michelle's sister discovered her body and called the police, she also informed their relatives about what had happened. Michelle's mother called Jason's parents while he was on his way from Clintwood to visit them. He decided to stop by his parents' house before heading home, and upon arrival, they told him about what had happened. Jason was shocked by the news and immediately left for Raleigh with other relatives. During this trip, a friend called Jason and told him that the police were asking a lot of questions about him. Jason made a strange decision and said he didn't want to talk to the police and wanted to hire a lawyer, which only increased the investigators' suspicions, but also gave them a new lead. Shelley, who was visiting the victim the day before the murder, told the police something interesting. Michelle had told her that she had been feeling like someone was constantly watching her lately. Shelley herself also felt like someone was watching them through the window that evening and even asked her friend to walk her to her car because she was a little scared to leave the house alone. Detectives tried to find any evidence related to possible surveillance, but continued to investigate Jason's potential involvement. Jason left his house in his car on November 2nd in the afternoon, and considering it was about a 6-hour drive to Clintwood, he decided to stop and stay at the Hampton Hotel, which is roughly halfway on the route. Detectives requested surveillance footage from this hotel and actually saw Jason check in at 10:54 p.m. And 2 minutes later, he used his key card to enter his room, and the card was not used again after that. The next morning, around 7:40 a.m., he called his mother, and the signal passed through a cell tower located near the town of Whiteville. This town was on the way from the hotel to Clintwood, where his business meeting was supposed to take place. The police also found out that the meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m., but Jason arrived 30 minutes late. When Jason arrived home with his relatives, the police seized his white Ford Explorer. Forensic experts could not find any blood or other evidence in it. They also examined the hotel room where the man stayed, but nothing was found there either. The same applied to all of Jason's clothing and belongings. Interesting, a pair of size 12 boots of the same brand were found in his car, the tracks of which were discovered in the house, but it was a model with a completely different pattern on the sole. A DNA sample was taken from the man by court order, which did not match the 2 hairs found on the victim's body. His fingerprints were also taken, although this was not particularly useful as they were everywhere in his home, of course. Experts could only determine that none of the fingerprints found contained traces of blood. Thus, the police were unable to find any evidence that could connect Jason to the murder. He did not speak to the police and used the services of a lawyer. Another fact indirectly spoke in favor of his innocence. When the police searched Jason's car, they found a hotel receipt and a fresh newspaper. A Hampton employee said he had slipped them under the door of his room somewhere between 3 and 5 a.m. This meant that the man was definitely in the hotel that morning. In the end, a rather complex situation arose. Jason could have killed his wife only if he had left the hotel unnoticed in the middle of the night, driven 270 kilometers to his home, committed the crime, cleaned his daughter of blood, then driven 270 kilometers back and quietly entered his room so that the electronic key did not register it. Detectives tried to figure out if this was possible in principle. They interviewed hotel staff, and here they came across an interesting lead. Early in the morning on November 3rd, one of the employees noticed that the fire door on the first floor was slightly open, held open by a small red stone. The employee was surprised because this door was always closed from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. He pulled out the stone from under the door and closed it. After that, the man decided to check the surveillance cameras and saw that one of them was not working, the one located on the stairwell next to the door. The employee approached it and realized that someone had disconnected the wire from the camera. He asked his colleague to return the wire to its place, and around 5:50 a.m., the camera started working again. From the recordings, the detectives established that the camera was turned off at 11:19 p.m. Then, something interesting happened at 6:35 a.m. Less than an hour after the camera was reconnected, it suddenly turned to face the ceiling. Given that there was no automatic mechanism to change its position, there was only one option. Someone manually turned the camera so it wouldn't face the hallway. The hotel management claimed that the camera had never been turned off before, and the only time someone turned it towards the ceiling was a few years ago when a guest wanted to leave the hotel unnoticed. This was a significant argument for the detectives that Jason could have left the hotel and gone home, then returned. The idea with the door and the camera was evident. The hotel's fire doors are designed in such a way that they can only be opened from inside the room. Jason could have used this door to leave the hotel without going through the main entrance, as he would have been seen by the employees and other cameras. Investigators interviewed all of Michelle's neighbors, and interesting clues awaited them here as well. On the night of the murder, around 4 a.m., a woman was delivering fresh newspapers to their area near Michelle's house when she noticed a light-colored SUV, but couldn't remember the model. Another neighbor left for work around 5:20 a.m. and also noticed a white SUV near Jason and Michelle's house. Passing by, she saw a man behind the wheel, but couldn't make out his face. What was even more interesting was that there was a woman sitting next to him in the passenger seat. The neighbor thought she was trying to hide her face from her. The third witness drove past her house around 6:15 a.m. and also saw a white SUV there, but no one was inside. Detectives believed that this car belonged to Jason, but it was a complete surprise to them that there was a woman in the car with him. Attempts to identify her were unsuccessful, but during the investigation, detectives found out that the man had been cheating on his wife with her friend since college. The woman lived in Florida, and Jason regularly went to see her under the guise of business trips. Detectives also discovered that the day before Michelle's murder, the lovers had called each other about 50 times, but the content of their conversations was unknown. Despite all this, the police still had no evidence linking Jason to the murder. He still refused to talk to the police without his lawyer present, but even in the presence of the attorney, he did not answer their questions. Detectives continued to actively work on the case, and ultimately, the investigation dragged on for many months. They were almost certain that it was Jason who committed the murder, but without substantial evidence, they were not in a hurry to arrest him. This happened only on December 14, 2009, 3 years after the murder. The investigators realized they would not be able to find any new evidence, so they gathered all the available materials and charged him with murder. The trial began 2 years later in June 2011. The prosecution insisted that Jason had premeditated the murder of his wife because he did not want to lose part of his property in the divorce. According to their version, He had initially decided to stay at that particular hotel because it would allow him to return home to commit the murder and then drive back. Former girlfriends of Jason also testified at the trial. One of them recounted that he had proposed to her and given her a ring, but later, during an argument, he grabbed her hand and took the ring off her finger. Given that the killer had removed the rings from Michelle's hand, these statements seemed significant to the prosecution, and another woman turned out to be Jason's second mistress and a friend of Michelle. She revealed that she spent time with the man at his home when Michelle went somewhere. She was also married, and on one of those nights, Jason removed her engagement ring from her finger. He did not return it until the next day, which seemed strange to the woman. Another mistress, a college friend of Michelle, also testified at the trial. She admitted that they had a romance, but the prints of their correspondence turned out to be much more interesting. Just a few days before the murder, he wrote to her, "I don't know how it all turned out this way, but I know how it will all end, with 2 broken hearts, but I don't care. I have a lot of suffering ahead of me, but you are worth it, even if only for a moment." Given that Michelle was killed just a few days after this message, its content was very disturbing. But one of the main witnesses was a woman who worked at a gas station between Raleigh and the town where Jason's hotel was located. She recounted that around 5:20 a.m., a man in a white SUV pulled up to the farthest pump. He tried to fill his car, but by law, people had to pay for gas first or show their ID at night. The driver went into the gas station and shouted at the employee, then threw $20 at her, filled the car with $15 worth of gas, and drove away without taking the change. The woman claimed to recognize this man from the photo. It was Jason Young. This witness changed the course of the case, as thanks to her it became known that Jason was between his home and the hotel early in the morning. This once again pointed to the fact that he could have killed his wife. At the trial, Michelle's sister, Meredith, also testified. After Michelle's murder, her daughter Cassidy stayed with her father, who moved in with his parents. For a long time, Michelle's relatives tried to obtain a court decision allowing them to take the girl to live with them temporarily. This went on for several years, and the lawyers were close to obtaining a positive decision when Jason simply relinquished full custody of Meredith, practically abandoning her. As a result, the girl moved in with her mother's relatives, who have been raising her without her father's involvement since then. Jason spoke for the first time at the trial, telling his version of events and denying that he killed his wife. He admitted that their marriage was falling apart, but insisted that they would have eventually divorced, and he had no motive to kill her. His lawyers argued that there was no evidence against Jason, and also tried to convince everyone that he could not physically have driven such a distance to kill his wife and return to the hotel early in the morning. They tried to calculate the average fuel consumption of his car and compare with data on how often he refueled. According to the lawyers, he would not have had enough fuel to make the trip. However, verifying this version was not possible. Nonetheless, the jurors could not reach a unanimous decision, and the judge was forced to declare a mistrial and schedule a new one for a year later. Against this backdrop, something else important happened. Michelle's relatives were convinced that Jason killed her, so they decided to file a civil lawsuit against him. Unlike in criminal trials, the required level of evidence for such lawsuits is lower, and the judge cannot sentence a person to prison. Jason completely ignored this lawsuit and decided not to participate in the process, which worked against him. After examining all the available evidence, the judge concluded that he was the one who killed his wife, and Jason was ordered to pay $15 million to Michelle's relatives. In the retrial, which began in 2012, the prosecution was allowed to use the decision in the civil lawsuit as an argument in favor of the suspect's guilt. In addition, they discovered something else during the preparation. It turned out that a year before Jason's murder, he had bought boots with the same pattern, the bloody imprint of which was left in Michelle's room, but they had not been able to find those shoes. These additional factors only strengthened the case against Jason, and this time, the jury found him guilty of murder. The man was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His lawyers tried to challenge the decision, and they continue to file appeals to this day, but all of them are rejected. This case was widely covered in the media, and its finale sparked heated discussions. On the one hand, over all these years, no physical evidence has been found that would connect Jason to the murder. On the other hand, a huge range of circumstantial evidence indicated that the man had orchestrated almost a perfect cover-up. If he had not stopped at the gas station that morning and had not caused a scene with the cashier, she might not have remembered his face. In that case, this case would still remain unsolved. As for the woman who was seen by a neighbor in the passenger seat of his car that night, everything is very ambiguous. There are no other clues that would indicate the involvement of other people in this crime. Other people's hair and DNA in the house did not guarantee this. It could have been left by one of the guests long before the murder. Nevertheless, the prosecution did not rule out 100% that someone could have helped Jason, but this moment remains a mystery. Rachel Moran was born on January 17, 1981 in England. She was the youngest of 4 children with 2 sisters and a brother. They all lived together in a city called Hull. From a young age, Rachel was interested in music and dance, particularly ballet. She excelled in school and went on to attend a local college to study information technology. Later, she changed her focus and decided to pursue her passion for dance. While in college, Rachel met a guy named Mark, and the two soon started dating. After some time, they decided to move in together and rented an apartment in a quiet residential area. The residential complex was just a kilometer away from Rachel's parents' home, so she would often visit them. Rachel also got a part-time job at a local bakery as a cake decorator. She quickly fell in love with this activity and began to consider pursuing a culinary education. In December 2002, when Rachel was 21, she and her boyfriend decided to get 2 kittens. Rachel took care of them, devoting most of her free time to them. Rachel and Mark made sure not to leave the kittens alone for too long, so they always tried to plan their activities so that one of them was at home and looking after the animals. As a result, they had already planned how they would celebrate New Year's Eve. Mark was supposed to go to his parents' house and come back home by night, while Rachel planned to go to a bar with her brother and celebrate New Year's Eve there. After that, she was supposed to return with her brother to her parents' house and spend the night there. On the evening of December 31st, Rachel met up with her brother and they went to a bar. Some mutual friends joined them at the bar and the group celebrated the New Year. After midnight, Rachel and her brother left the establishment and arrived at their parents' home around 1:20 a.m. Before going to bed, Rachel talked to her mother and decided to call her boyfriend to see how he was doing. However, Mark did not answer the home phone, so she called his mobile. This time, he picked up and said that friends had invited him to a party. Rachel was upset that Mark had left the house contrary to their agreement and left the kittens alone all night. She decided not to stay at her parents' house and planned to go home. Upon learning this, her mother tried to dissuade her daughter, as it was late at night and she was concerned for her safety. Despite their lengthy argument, Rachel still headed home, promising to call her mother as soon as she arrived. Her mother waited for about an hour and a half, but there was no call from her daughter. She then called Rachel, first on her mobile and then on her home phone, but there was no answer. She thought that Rachel might have gone to the party where her boyfriend was, and that was why she wasn't answering the phone. The mother tried to reach her until about 4:30 a.m., but eventually decided to go to sleep. She woke up around 10 a.m. and saw that her husband was on the phone. She hoped that he had spoken to Rachel, but it was their eldest daughter on the line. She called her parents because she could not reach Rachel all morning and was causing her a lot of worry. Realizing that the young woman still hadn't returned home, all of her relatives began to panic. They continued to try to call her, and after some time, Mark answered the phone. The boy was surprised when he was asked, "Is Rachel home?" He said that he had returned home at around 7 a.m. and the young woman wasn't there. The young man thought that she had stayed overnight with her parents, so he didn't think much of it and went to sleep. According to Mark, there were no signs that Rachel had been home. Her things were missing, the bed was made up as it was when he left, and no one had fed the kittens. All of this made Rachel's family panic even more. They called all of their daughter's friends and other relatives, but no one had seen her that night. Rachel's parents then decided to contact the police. Despite the fact that Rachel was almost 22 years old and investigators could have waited some time after the disappearance of an adult, in this case, they decided to start searching immediately. They searched her apartment and talked to all of her relatives and friends. The police immediately dismissed the idea that Rachel had simply run away on her own. Her entire biography and stories from close people contradicted such a possibility. During the conversation with the investigators, Rachel's mother remembered one moment that night when Rachel was going back to her apartment. Her mother started arguing with her literally on the doorstep of the house where they stood with the door open, while the woman tried to persuade her daughter to stay. At some point, an unknown man walked down the street, and Rachel's mother even thought about asking him to accompany her daughter home, but changed her mind. After receiving a rather superficial description of this person, the police began searching for him as he was walking in the same direction that Rachel was going to a few minutes later, so he might have seen something. They sent out descriptions to all patrol officers and continued to look for other clues. Detectives started to look into Mark, the boyfriend of the missing young woman. Firstly, they found out that there was an argument between them on the night when Rachel learned that he had gone to a party. Secondly, during the conversation with the police, Mark didn't seem upset despite his girlfriend's disappearance in the middle of the night. All of this led investigators to believe that he might have something to do with her disappearance, so they decided to check his alibi. Mark claimed that he returned from the party after 6 a.m. The police talked to all the people who were there, and they confirmed the young man's words. The young woman's relatives also insisted that he would never harm her. Investigators requested data from Rachel's mobile phone operator and bank. They found out that since her disappearance, she had not used her phone or bank cards. At that time, they could not track the location of her phone, and data from cell towers was practically useless at such a short distance. After that, the police decided to obtain all records from surveillance cameras within a 10-kilometer radius of her route. They sent patrols to every store and also spoke to residents in these areas, hoping that someone had security cameras installed. Soon, they managed to spot Rachel on one of the cameras just a couple hundred meters from her residential complex. This once again confirmed that she was heading home and not somewhere else. Detectives focused their search on this area. They brought in search dogs, helicopters, and dozens of officers who combed the streets, fields, and waterways. They also began to drain streams and artificial canals to fully search them, but all of this yielded no results. Days went by, and the police increasingly leaned towards the possibility that Rachel may no longer be alive, yet they continued their active and extensive search. 2 weeks later, they had their first worrying lead. One of the nearby channels had dried up, and they found Rachel's shoe inside, the same shoe she was wearing when she left her mother's house. The next day, they found a garbage bag in the same channel with a woman's purse containing cosmetics, a phone, and other items, including Rachel Moran's passport. These items led her family and investigators to believe that she was most likely dead, and the police continued to search the channels. They considered the possibility that an unknown perpetrator had dumped Rachel's body there, but further searches yielded no results. In the following days, detectives put even more effort into the case. They decided to use a popular tactic in England where police found a woman who looked like Rachel, dressed her in similar clothing to what Rachel was wearing on the night of her disappearance, and asked her to retrace Rachel's steps. The whole thing was filmed and later handed over to local TV stations by investigators. The purpose of this experiment was to find witnesses who may have seen Rachel on the night she disappeared, but didn't attach any significance to it or had forgotten. In this case, visual reconstruction of events might help them remember details, and it worked. After the footage was made public, several people contacted the police and shared their observations. The detectives checked them, but ultimately it didn't lead to any useful information. However, they did manage to obtain something significant. In addition to the witnesses, owners of CCTV cameras installed in the area also approached them. During the first few days of the investigation, the police had received most of these recordings, but they missed some, which proved valuable. The management of a school located approximately 150 meters from Rachel's apartment handed over their footage from the night. The police officer saw a woman walking in the direction of the same residential complex. The recording quality was very poor, but based on the time, investigators assumed it was Rachel. Just a few seconds later, someone else walked by, and the detectives thought it could be the unknown criminal who might have attacked her. Unfortunately, the recording quality did not allow them to see any features. Then the police assumed that if this person was behind Rachel's abduction, he wouldn't have been able to drag her body too far because he was without a car. They assumed the culprit lived in the area and decided to try to search every house within a 2-kilometer radius of that location. Of course, they needed the residents' permission as well as a lot of time. Therefore, the investigators hired more than 100 officers who knocked on all residential buildings and apartments asking for permission to search the premises. The police started their work on January 28th and divided themselves into groups of 3, each of which included a specialist who knew how to properly search the premises. Several hours later, one of these groups came to Nash Court Street, and the police officers began knocking on every door. After they reached the last apartment, something alarming awaited them. They immediately called the chief detective and asked him to come there urgently. When the police officers knocked on the last door, a man opened it and let them in. The officers searched the premises but didn't notice anything suspicious. However, before leaving, one of them saw a small garbage storage closet, which was quite common in such apartments, and they decided to check it out. But the closet door was locked. Officers asked the man to give them the key, but he said he couldn't remember where it was. They continued to insist that he look for the key to make sure that there was nothing in his apartment. The man searched the apartment, and after some time, he finally found the key. The police opened the door and found many garbage bags, empty packages, boxes, and other items inside. They began to clean up the mess since the closet was filled to the brim. At some point, one of the officers froze, having pulled out another bag. He saw a human foot. After a few seconds, he retrieved the rest of the garbage and realized that Rachel Moran's body was in front of him, wrapped in a blanket and barely fitting in the closet. The room was very low, and the officers were greatly surprised at how the criminal managed to fit a human body in there. The police immediately arrested the apartment owner and his friend, who was visiting him at the time of their visit. The tenant was 23-year-old Michael Little, who reacted calmly to his arrest, but his friend was shocked by what was happening. He did not see what was in the closet and did not understand why they were being detained. After arresting them, the officers called the chief detective and waited for his arrival. Initially, one car arrived at the scene and the police took the apartment owner's friend to the station. Little remained in the apartment with another officer, waiting for the next crew. The officer decided not to waste time and tried to talk to the man. To his surprise, Little almost immediately began to confess to all the details of what had happened. He started his story with the words, "I'm so glad you found her. I've been wanting to tell someone about this for a long time." He told the officer the chronology of events that led to the young woman's death, but the officer considered this version to be questionable. According to Little, on New Year's Eve, he noticed Rachel on the street. He approached and spoke to her, inviting her to his apartment, and the young woman agreed, and they went to his place. There they drank a little, after which a quarrel broke out between them. Little did not specify the reason, but only said that he left for another room. Returning to the kitchen, he saw that Rachel was standing with her back to him. The man approached her and noticed that the young woman was holding a knife in her hand, and the next second, she turned to him and cut his hand. Little panicked, grabbed a kitchen knife, and struck her, which resulted in Rachel's death. The police doubted the truthfulness of this story, as it sounded quite illogical. However, they recorded Little's confession and soon took him to the station. During questioning, he confirmed everything he had told the officer and insisted that he acted in self-defense. When asked why he didn't call the police in that case, Little stated that he was scared and thought that no one would believe him, so he decided to hide the body in his closet. Studying his biography, the police learned that Little had an impressive criminal history. From an early age, he was caught stealing and committing other minor offenses. He was expelled from school several times, as a result of which he did not even receive a basic education. The man practically did not work, stayed at home, used alcohol and drugs. The police talked to several of his friends who said that Little often fantasized about meeting different women. Once he even told them that he was dating a beautiful blonde who was 180 centimeters tall, although his friends knew perfectly well that he was not in a relationship with anyone. This detail seemed interesting to the detectives. Rachel had approximately the same height and light hair. They assumed that Little fantasized about a young woman of this type and could choose Rachel as his victim based on these parameters. At the same time, the police established that the young woman was not acquainted with Little, although they lived on neighboring streets. The investigators attempted to reconstruct the timeline of that night and found out that on the evening of December 31st, the suspect met with his friends to prepare for New Year's Eve. But Little left their company. He became angry when the young woman he was trying to flirt with left with his friend. Little then went to another party, but shortly after midnight, he said he was going home. The route from the party location followed the same road that Rachel was walking on. Combining all the available facts, the detectives came to a disturbing conclusion. Remember that stranger who passed Rachel and her mother when she was trying to persuade her daughter not to walk home and even thought about asking that man to accompany Rachel? According to the police, that person was Little. This version was indirectly confirmed by surveillance camera footage. Detectives reviewed the recordings where Rachel was first recorded. About 3 minutes before that moment, a man who looked like Little walked along the same road. But on the second recording, everything changed. When Rachel was captured by another camera, an unknown man was already walking behind her. If it was Little, he would have had to stop somewhere and wait for the young woman to pass, after which he began to pursue her. This version of events contradicted the man's own account, but even more contradictions arose after medical experts presented their reports. On the victim's body, they found 27 stab wounds inflicted with tremendous force, and Rachel had no defensive wounds, despite Little's claim of struggling with her. In addition, some of the blows were delivered to the young woman's back, and as for the suspect himself, no cuts were found on his hands. All these facts unequivocally indicated that his story did not match reality. Based on all the available data, the detectives arrived at a more plausible version. That night, Little was angry because he was rejected at the first party. As he passed by Rachel's mother's house, he overheard part of their conversation and understood that Rachel was going home alone. Rachel also fit the type of woman that Little fantasized about, and he decided to either attack her or try to talk to her. Moving forward, he left the main road and waited for Rachel to pass by, then began to follow her. The situation could have developed in two scenarios. Either he immediately attacked her or tried to flirt with her. In the second case, Rachel would likely have ignored him and walked away. Firstly, she had a boyfriend. Secondly, she wouldn't have gone to the home of a stranger who approached her on the street in the middle of the night. And thirdly, Rachel was very concerned about her kittens. When she found out that her boyfriend had left them all night, she couldn't think of anything else and tried to get home as quickly as possible. It was much more likely that he attacked the young woman when she was as close to his house as possible and dragged her into his apartment. Soon, the forensic experts found evidence of this. There were traces of dirt on the back of Rachel's legs, indicating that she had been dragged on the ground. Forensic experts also established that the young woman was not killed in the kitchen, but in the hallway. That's where most of the bloodstains were found, which the perpetrator tried to wash off. In connection with this, the police suggested that Little killed her immediately after they were in the apartment. Nevertheless, the medical experts found that the victim had been subjected to violence, and Little's DNA was found on her body. Given the alleged chronology of events, by that time, Rachel could already be dead. Based on all of this, on January 31st, Little was charged with murder. However, by that time, Little had already hired a lawyer and decided to retract his initial statement, claiming that he did not kill anyone. In the end, the case was taken to court, and the trial began in October, where Little's lawyers presented a new version of events. Now the man claimed that the real killer was his friend, Mark Fuller, the same person who was arrested with him on the day the body was discovered, but later released as no evidence linked him to the crime. Little claimed that he returned to the house closer to morning and saw his friend and Rachel there. Mark told him that they had met the young woman and decided to go to Little's apartment since Mark had the keys. They all drank together, after which Rachel went with Little to the bedroom and had intimate contact with him. Soon after that, a furious Mark burst into the room. He had feelings for the young woman and went into a rage upon learning about their relationship. He grabbed a knife and inflicted numerous blows on Rachel, then threatened Little. He demanded that Little help him clean up the blood and never tell anyone about what had happened. Otherwise, he threatened to kill not only him, but also his loved ones. As you can guess, nobody believed this story. It contradicted not only the evidence, but also common sense. Everything pointed to Little being the killer, and there was not a single piece of evidence implicating his friend. The trial ended quickly because the defense was unable to present any evidence refuting their client's guilt. As a result, Little was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 25 years, meaning he could be released at the age of 58 if his request is approved. Rachel's murder was a strong blow to all of her relatives, but her older sister suffered the most. The young woman had diabetes, and the illness had a significant impact on her health in the wake of the stress she endured. After a prolonged struggle, she passed away in 2010, and her family blames Little for everything. So this criminal's actions led to 2 deaths. Ian Brady was born on January 2, 1938, in Glasgow, Scotland. His mother, Margaret Stewart, worked as a waitress, and who his father was is not known. According to his mother herself, he was a local journalist and died 3 months before her son was born. Realizing that she herself simply cannot cope with the upbringing of a child, Margaret gave 3-month-old Ian to the Sloan family. They had 4 children of their own, but they accepted the boy. Ian took their last name, but continued to see his mother regularly. At the age of 9, he and his family moved to the town of Pollock, where he enrolled in the local school. From an early age, his acquaintances noticed Ian's cruelty to animals. They later described the terrible things the child did. At school, his behavior only worsened. He twice broke into other people's homes, for which he ended up in the hands of the police. Alas, no serious punishment was incurred by this future maniac due to his age. In addition, Ian constantly bullied the younger children. At age 15, he left school and got a job at the shipyard. But after less than a year, the young man changed his occupation and became a messenger butcher. At the age of 16, he was again put on trial. His girlfriend, Eleven Grant, went to a dance with another boy, for which Ian threatened her with a knife. The judge placed him on probation on one condition: the young man must live with his birth mother. So he did, moving to Manchester to live with his mother and her new husband, Patrick Brady. As you may have guessed, the would-be maniac took his stepfather's last name. He arranged for him to work as a porter of fruit at the market, but the hard work was not to Ian's liking. A year after the move, he was caught by the police on theft with a bag of lead seals. The young man intended to sell them on the black market and make extra money. But instead of money, he earned his first real sentence. Given that he was under 18 at the time of the crime, the judge sentenced Ian to 2 years in a juvenile facility. While serving his sentence, the young man managed to get alcohol in prison and got pretty drunk. For this, he was transferred to a stricter institution, where he completed serving his sentence on November 14, 1953. Back in Manchester, Ian changed 2 jobs, but he was drawn to something more. Determined to improve his education, he began reading books. True, not all of these books were useful. One of his favorite works was Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. In addition, he liked books about the crimes of the Nazis. Myra Hindley was born 4 years after Ian, on July 23, 1942, in an area of Manchester. Her family was not an ideal family. Her alcoholic father regularly beat his daughter and instilled violence in her. The family lived in a dilapidated house with only one room that was more or less safe. After her parents had another daughter, Myra was sent to live with her grandmother. Her father taught the girl self-defense in a rather brutal way. He demanded that his daughter could fight back against any abuser and did not tolerate weakness. Once he made her beat up a neighbor's boy who scratched her cheek. Later, the maniac called this incident her first victory. Another shock in the girl's youth was the death of her close friend. 13-year-old Michael Higgins. One day, he invited her to go for a swim in the local abandoned reservoir, but she refused. As a result, the boy drowned, and Myra felt guilty. After that incident, the girl gradually began to delve into religion. She joined the parish of the local church and became godmother to Higgins' nephew. At 16, the girl took a job as a clerk in a small firm. Her duties were basic: brewing coffee, fetching something, printing out documents. Despite this, she won the love of the team from the very first days. After receiving her first paycheck, Myra spent it in a week, leaving her without a livelihood. Then her co-workers chipped in and gave her the same amount from their pockets. Around the same time, the girl planned to get engaged to her boyfriend, Ronnie Sinclair, but later changed her mind. At 17, she changed jobs, but she did not show the same enthusiasm for the new place. 6 months later, she was fired for constant absenteeism. At the same time, Myra went to the judo section, where even the guys didn't dare to fight with her. Once she got a taste for it, she could not stop in time and caused serious injury to her opponents. At the same time, Myra dyed her hair pink. The future maniacs met at Millward, where both got jobs. Myra was 19 years old at the time. Ian was 23. According to the young woman's diary, their first conversation took place on July 27, 1961. At first, Myra felt sympathy for the young man, despite his criminal record, but later lost interest. However, 6 months after they met, Ian asked her out to a movie, and the young woman agreed. The choice of a movie for a first date was As Strange as Possible, a documentary about the Nuremberg trials, and they agreed on that. The couple continued to go to the movies for the most violent films, and soon Brady instilled in Myra an enduring interest in Nazis. Often they sat down together to read materials and books about the atrocities of the Third Reich while drinking German wine. Because of her new fascination, Myra began to imitate the Aryan young woman model. She dyed her hair white and started using dark red lipstick. Later, she dramatically changed her style of dressing to a more candid: short skirts, leather jackets, and high-heeled shoes. The couple continued to work together, but every day they paid less and less attention to the team. To call their relationship perfect at the time was impossible. In a letter to her old friend, Myra once reported that Ian had slipped her sleeping pills. A few months later, she asked him not to pay any attention to that letter. Considering that the couple had little money in those years, they began to look for ways to get rich quickly. Eventually, Ian and Myra decided to rob a bank. The young woman rented a van and tried to learn how to shoot, but she failed to master the skill. Despite this, she eventually acquired a rifle and 2 revolvers. Eventually, the couple decided to abandon the idea. They were probably well aware that without the proper training and experience, they would not succeed. Instead, they really got into photography and bought professional equipment. But they only took pictures of each other, and not in a very decent way. 2 years after meeting, in June 1963, Ian came to Myra and her grandmother. A little later, they were given new housing under a government program, since the old one was considered unsafe. It was also at this time that Brady first voiced to Myra his deepest dream of committing the perfect murder. He was inspired by the book Coercion by Meyer Levin, in which 2 teenagers planned to kill a 12-year-old boy and avoid the death penalty. The young woman was not deterred by this revelation and agreed to help her lover. The plan was very simple. Myra and Ian were going to look for the victim along the road, then take her to a remote place and kill her. Brady told Myra to drive the van down the street alone, while he himself was to follow her on a motorcycle. Upon spotting a suitable victim, the maniac was about to signal his accomplice with his headlamp, after which she was to convince the victim to get into the car. On the evening of July 12, Just 1 month after moving in, they went out hunting. Brady chose the first victim and signaled Myra, but she drove off, past him. Catching up with her, he demanded an explanation. The young woman reported that the maniac's target was 7-year-old Marie Ruck, who lived next door to her mother. According to Myra, it would be extremely difficult for them to get away with it because the police would start searching for such a young child instantly. The couple then continued down the street, looking for another victim. At 8 p.m. on Froxmer Street, Brady again made his choice, and Myra again recognized the girl. She turned out to be Pauline Reed, a 16-year-old friend of her younger sister, who was on her way to the disco. Determined to act, Myra stopped and offered her a ride, whereupon the girl got into the car. To take her to a deserted place, Myra made up a story. She had supposedly lost a very expensive glove on the Saddleworth Heath. The area was popular with the locals for its rich supply of peat used as fertilizer. The unfortunate Pauline agreed to help her acquaintance. Shortly after arriving at the site, Grady drove up to them. Myra told the girl it was her boyfriend and he would help them in their search. How the situation unfolded further is unclear to the end. The problem is that Brady and Myra tell two different versions, but they all end up with the same story. Pauline is murdered. In Ian's version, he and his lover abused and killed the girl. Myra, on the other hand, claimed that she was left sitting in the car while Pauline and Brady went supposedly to look for the glove. After a while, the maniac returned alone and reported that the girl was dead. He took Myra to her body and she noticed that the girl's clothes were badly wrinkled. In my opinion, Myra's version makes no sense. What excuse would a 16-year-old girl have for going on a search with a guy she didn't know while Myra herself was sitting in the car? Most likely, with this story, the maniac was only trying to absolve herself of responsibility for direct participation in the murder. After burying the body, Myra and Brady loaded the motorcycle into the van and drove home. On the way, they spotted Pauline's mother and her brother looking for the girl. After a break of almost 6 months, the couple decided to act again, but this time they chose a 12-year-old boy. After spotting the victim in a store, they struck up a dialogue and offered the child a ride home. As an added incentive, Brady offered the boy a drink. Once in the car, he specified that the alcohol would have to be picked up at their house. But first, a pair of maniacs asked the child to help find a fictional glove in Saddleworth. To his misfortune, the boy agreed. Next, the situation unfolded according to the same scenario. Hindley asserted that Brady had taken the child away from the car, abused and killed him. The maniac once again stated that she was not present for all of this. 7 months later, on June 16, 1964, the couple similarly abducted 12-year-old Keith Bennett as he was on his way to his grandmother's house. He suffered the same fate of violence and murder. The police, who at the time were unaware of the existence of serial killers, first arrested the boy's stepfather, but found no evidence against him. The next murder was also committed 6 months later, on December 26, 1964. It is not quite clear whether they were able to sustain this cycle unintentionally or whether the pause was necessary to lull the police into a state of alertness. You would agree that if children started disappearing one after another in a relatively small town, law enforcement would throw all their energy into catching the maniac. But back to December 26th of that year, few days remained before the New Year and Christmas, and Ian and Myra decided to give their town another unpleasant gift. This time, the scenario has changed dramatically. They looked for their new victim on the playground. She was 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey. Scattering bags of purchases near the car, the maniacs asked the girl to help with the collection. After they also asked her to help them bring the bags home, the girl agreed and was attacked as soon as she crossed the threshold. the couple abused the unfortunate child for a long time, right in her home. Having played with her, the sadist killed her and took the corpse to Saddleworth. Again, Myra assured that she was not present at the murder. The attentive viewer remembers that the couple lived with Myra's grandmother. Where had she gone at the time of all these atrocities? Early in the morning on the day of the murder, the caring granddaughter sent her to a relative's house and forbade her to return home. In spite of this, the old woman tried to return in the evening, but Myra simply would not let her in. The next day, after cleaning up the girl's corpse and the house, she still brought the grandmother back. The couple committed their next murder 10 months later, breaking a peculiar cycle. But that's not the only thing that makes this case special. At the time, Maureen, Myra's younger sister, already had a husband, David Smith, 17. The couple often spent time together, and the young man immediately won Brady's affection. First of all, he was ready to listen with interest to everything the maniac said. Speculations about Nazis, philosophical speeches, dreams about robbing a bank, and so on. Secondly, he had already been in the police station more than once, just as Ian had been in his years. Even their crimes were very similar. Smith had been caught breaking into someone else's house and inflicting severe battery. Perhaps Brady saw him as his protege, a new member of the improvised gang. As time passed, the young man made more and more visits to their house, where, in long conversations with Ian, talk of murder began to spill over. It got to the point where Myra began to seriously worry if their relative would run to the police. But Brady was adamant. He thought Smith was his own and trusted him. Shortly before the next crime, he even told her that he and Smith would soon commit a crime together. It all happened on the evening of October 6, 1965. Myra and Brady went to Manchester Central Station to look for a new victim, and soon Ian made his choice. He met 17-year-old Edward Evans, who agreed to go to his house after a little chat. Upon arriving at the house, the company drank wine, and at a certain point, Brady sent Myra to get Smith. After he arrived, the action began to unfold rapidly. From Myra's words, it was possible to reconstruct the following picture. She had gone into the kitchen to feed the dogs. Smith remained in the living room. A few minutes later, she heard screams and sounds of fighting. Upon entering the room, the girl saw Evans and Brady struggling. After a brief fight, Ian grabbed an axe and struck the victim several times with the blade. He then wrapped an electrical wire around the neck of the unconscious Evans and strangled him. After what he had done, Brady wanted to take the body immediately to the wasteland, but it was too heavy. In addition, the maniac twisted his leg during the fight. In the end, he decided to leave it at the house and go with Smith to Saddleworth the next day. He asked him to stay so he could feel the gravity of what he had done. At first, Smith agreed to help Brady get rid of the body. Perhaps he was too frightened to refuse. With a little history of minor lawbreaking under his belt, the young man might not have shared the sadistic tendencies of the homicidal couple. When he returned home, he decided to tell his wife what had happened at her sister's house. After listening, she asked him to report the horror to the police. Smith listened to her and called the police from a nearby phone booth at 6 in the morning. His story was slightly different from what Myra could later say. The police archives contain an exact transcript of that call. Brady opened the door and said in a loud voice, "You want the little buns?" I nodded to say yes, and he led me into the kitchen and gave me 3 small buns with a drink and said, "You want the rest too?" When I entered the house, the door to the living room was closed. Ian went into the living room and I stayed waiting in the kitchen. I waited a minute or two, and then suddenly I heard a wild scream, like a woman screaming, a very high-pitched voice. Then the screaming continued, one after another very loudly. Then I heard Myra screaming very loudly to him, "Dave, help him." When I ran in, I just stood in the living room and saw the young guy. He was lying head and shoulders on the couch, and his feet were on the floor. He was face up. Ian was standing over him, facing him. The guy was still screaming. Ian had an axe in his hand. He held it over his head and hit the guy on the left side of his head with the axe. I heard the blow. It was a terribly hard blow. It was a horrible sound. Although Smith told it all in his usual monotone voice, the abundance of detail made the police take the call as seriously as possible. They decided to proceed carefully to get into the house without a court order. A policeman drove up to the scene and picked up a local baker who delivers bread in the morning. Wearing his apron, he took a couple of loaves from him and knocked on the maniac's door. An unsuspecting Myra opened it. Next, the policeman took out his identification card and quickly made his way into the house, where he caught Brady. He was writing an explanatory letter to work, asking for time off because of an injury. The officer told a made-up story about investigating gun cases and asked to see the house. It was unclear why, but Myra agreed. He inspected all but one room, the one where the young man's body lay. Because it was locked, the policeman asked to open it, but Myra said she had left the keys at work. Of course, there was no credibility to the story. The officer offered to drive the young woman to her place of work and retrieve the key, but she gave up and opened the door. After finding the body, Brady was immediately arrested. Before leaving the house, he told a police officer that there had been an argument between him and Evans, trying to make it look like self-defense. When questioned, he continued with his version, but it sounded very unconvincing. Brady allegedly met Evans in a bar, a fight ensued, and somehow the boy came to his house where the fight ensued. Smith had also testified against Brady at the time, and the police believed his testimony much more. Ian later insisted that Smith had been directly involved in the murder. The young man described how Ian bragged about killing 3 or 4 children and even gave the approximate locations of their burial. He also revealed the presence of 2 evidence suitcases in which the killers kept various trophies. The problem was that these suitcases were stored in some unknown lost and found office in Manchester. It took the police several days to find them. The arrest of the maniacs was followed by a search of their home. There, the police found many interesting finds: notebooks, lists of names, photographs of Brady and Myra Saddleworth, and explicit pictures of them. The notebooks contained lists of coded words, which the police were quickly able to decipher. It turned out that Brady kept records of burial sites, weapons, and methods of killing. Alas, it was impossible to ascertain the exact location of all the victims on the basis of this information, as it was rather superficial. Another book contained a list of names, including all the victims of the couple. But here's the strange thing. In addition to the victims we know, the list contained the names of other children. With all this information, the investigators questioned Brady again, and his story was once again very weak. Allegedly, the list contained the names of his friends, and he had joked about killing children in his conversation with Smith. At the same time, the police managed to find the very suitcases, the contents of which shocked everyone. There were photographs of a naked girl. Also found in them were audio tapes, one of which would soon become perhaps the most damning evidence in history. It contained cries and pleas for help. Other tapes contained recordings of Nazi plays. After listening to the tape, one of the mothers recognized the voice of her daughter, Leslie Ann Downey. It is frightening to imagine how difficult all this was for the poor woman. In addition, the suitcases contained many photographs of the backdrop of the marshland, various batons and lashes, and erotic magazines. All of this, including a recording of the girl screaming and a photograph of her, would have been enough to press charges. But the police had yet to read Saddleworth. They faced the daunting task of identifying the victims' burial sites from the many photos. They were also assisted in this by a 12-year-old neighbor, Myra, who had once gone with them to the swamp to pick peat. It is not known why, but the maniacs left the girl alive. Perhaps Myra and Brady's guilt in such a case would have been obvious. 150 officers were involved in the search for bodies in the swamps. Initially, they focused on the area near Route A628, but later, based on witness statements, they moved to Route A635. That's where their first find awaited them. On October 10th, police noticed a hand sticking out of the ground. Because of the degree of decomposition of the body, the identity of the child could not be confirmed until after the examination. She turned out to be Leslie Ann Downey. 11 days later, police discovered the body of John Kilbride. At the same time, Brady and Myra were charged with Leslie's murder, extending their custody. Despite this baggage of evidence, Ian continued to try to feed the police flimsy tales in an effort to avoid punishment. When asked about the origin of the nude photographs of the little girl taken at the Hindley house, he did not deny that he had taken them. However, he insisted that the girl had been brought to their home by two men and then taken away to an unknown destination. Because of the onset of winter, the police temporarily halted their search of the swamps, but a virtually win-win case had already formed against Myra and Brady. On April 19, 1966, one of the most high-profile trials in British history began. Both lovers were charged with the murder of Edward Evans, Leslie Downey, and John Kilbride. The turning point was the very recording of little Leslie's last words. The case hurt her from the first to the last second. The reporters in attendance called the tape the most damning evidence ever put on the judge's desk. The trial lasted more than 2 weeks, and on May 6, the court found the maniacs guilty, sentencing them to life in different prisons. That was the last day they saw each other. The couple kept up an active correspondence, but over the years their fervor waned and their letters came less and less frequently. The trial was remembered for another interesting moment. David Smith, who became the main witness, signed a contract with a local newspaper under which he undertook to give an exclusive interview in case Myra and Brady were convicted. The paper paid him £1,000 for this, which was quite a substantial sum at the time. Smith and his wife spent the money on a holiday in a 5-star French hotel, which angered the judge. He found such a transaction inappropriate, but there was nothing he could do about it within the law. Since then, the story of Myra and Brady split into 2 lines, but it was not over. In 1974, Ian managed to change several prisons until he finally stayed at Wormwood Scrubs. Here began the most interesting part. The maniac managed to abuse children while in prison. How is that possible? Shortly after his transfer to Wormwood Scrubs, Brady, who had been placed in solitary confinement, went on a hunger strike. He was unhappy with the ban on socializing with other inmates. Prison officials have decided that the child killer is going to afterlife rather quickly. As a result of his dramatic weight loss, the maniac was transferred to the hospital wing, where his life took on new colors. He was allowed to watch television and do house cleaning work. At the same time, juvenile delinquents with mental disabilities were admitted to the hospital wing of the prison. In 1981, one of these teenagers said that Brady had forced him into intimate contact. Later, similar statements by the victims surfaced repeatedly. Taking advantage of access to secluded corners of the prison as a janitor, Ian led his victims there. When prison officials learned of this, he was banned from cleaning, but no further charges were filed. More interestingly, he was left in the hospital wing, next to the same teenagers. It would seem how such a thing is possible, but there was nothing the chief medical officer of the prison could do about it. British law mandates that prisoners be assisted, and Brady used this skillfully. He threatened to resume his hunger strike every time he talked about being transferred back to a cell. In 1982, a harsh decision was made to transfer the maniac to another prison with stricter conditions. However, 3 years later, in 1985, Brady was declared insane. Thanks to this, another transfer awaited him to Ashworth Psychiatric Hospital. Many of you may have wondered how such a violent sadist managed not only to establish a comfortable life in prison, but also to do his dirty work with teenagers. The answer might surprise you. He was helped by the Earl of Longford, Frank Pakenham, one of the leading politicians of the time, to get favors and privileges. Brady approached him while in prison, and soon the Earl actually sided with him. Of course, there was no talk of helping to get the charges dropped, but Ian didn't count on that. Pakenham helped him stay in hospital by appealing to Britain's Home Security himself. After that, the politician repeatedly bailed out his newly minted friend by pulling the right strings in the British upper echelons. But the main request of Brady he could not fulfill. The maniac dreamed of a date with Myra. On that note, let's move back a bit to Hindley's story. Her life behind bars was much less intense, but not without interesting moments. While in prison, she managed to have a mistress, but more interestingly, she was able to get out of there for a while. Not long after beginning her sentence, Hindley began a torrid affair with the warden, Patricia Cairns. Together, they planned an escape, but were caught by the police in the preparation stage. As a result, Cairns went from a prison employee to a prisoner for 6 years. In November 1986, Keith Bennett's mother wrote her a letter, begging her to tell her about her son's fate. It was filled with pain and despair, and the last lines make clear, "I am a simple woman working in the kitchens of Christie's Hospital. It took me 5 weeks to write this letter because it is very important to me that it be accepted by you as it is. A plea for help. Please, Miss Hindley, help me." It is impossible to say for certain whether Hindley was moved by this or whether there were other motives, but she agreed to take part in the investigative experiment. Under tight security, she was taken to Saddleworth Heath, which was cordoned off by 200 police officers along its perimeter. Myra's task was to locate the bodies of children whose fate was still unknown. She failed in that task. The search yielded no results. The detectives who organized her participation were harshly criticized for wasting money on an event of this scale. However, it bore fruit a little later. One of the detectives continued to visit the woman in prison, and soon she decided to partially confess to a number of crimes. Myra recounted all the murders, but insisted she was never there at those moments. Of course, no one was in a hurry to believe it, but the detective was happy with the new information in any volume. Since then, Myra had been out on the heath several more times, and in 1987, the cops were successful, and that's what you call the discovery of Leslie Ann Downey's body and later Pauline Reed's. Once Brady learned of his former lover's cooperation with the investigation, he also decided to partially confess to what he had done. True, the maniac asked to be given the means and opportunity to leave his life, which no one could legally do. Having been refused, Ian still talked and also expressed his desire to help the police in their search for the remaining bodies. On July 3rd of that year, he was taken to Saddleworth, where he was never able to pinpoint Keith Bennett's burial site. Later, frustrated detectives refused to make another trip to the heath with the maniac, and he turned to reporters. In a letter, he indirectly admitted that he had killed 5 other children, but police could not confirm this information. 6 months later, Brady still secured a second visit to Saddleworth, but again proved useless. Keith's body has not been found to this day. In 2003, the police resumed their search using the most advanced technology. It gave no results. They only had 40-year-old photos, which made finding the right place next to impossible. Myra made a long attempt to obtain an early release. She wrote appeals, secured Lord Longford's support, and by the early noughties, almost everyone was convinced that her release was inevitable. Unfortunately for her, life decided otherwise. Hindley died on 15 November 2002 at the age of 60. The cause was complications from a heart condition. The rest of Brady's life was less rosy. While Myra's release was seriously considered, Ian's release from the asylum was being given the go-ahead by senior British officials. With each year in the asylum, he gradually went mad until he lost what little, if any, sanity he had left. In spite of this, he managed to live long enough until he was 79 years old. In 2017, the maniac died of cancer, and the urn with his ashes was buried at the bottom of the sea. Brady's death made few people sad. His namesake, Police Federation Branch Chairman Ian Hansen, noted that such monsters deserved no sympathy. That was the end of the story of the child-murdering lovers. But in Britain, their names will long be remembered. Ian and Myra are a prime example of inhumanity, boundless impotence and cynicism, as well as a total lack of morality. Jennifer Halland was born on February 23, 1988, in a small American village called Wimberley, Texas. She had loving parents, a sister named Diana, and a carefree, peaceful childhood. Soon, her family moved to a city called Bryan, which was about 200 kilometers from her native village. After finishing school, the young woman entered a local college called Blinn College, where she planned to study to become a legal assistant and hoped to connect her future life with jurisprudence. She had many friends who spoke of her as a kind, hard-working, and friendly young woman. She always looked at life positively and looked forward to her future career. Jenna settled near her college, renting an apartment in Autumn Woods Apartments. She also got a job as a waitress in a local restaurant to cover her housing expenses and not rely on her parents financially. Despite a busy schedule in which she had to combine studying and working, Jenna often spent time with her boyfriend, Spencer Hood. They had been dating since high school but lived separately. Even after Jenna moved into a rented apartment, their relationship had been going on for several years, although the couple argued periodically. On April 8, 2008, Jenna, who was 20 years old at the time, finished her shift and at around 9 p.m. headed home. Since Spencer studied with her at the same college and lived nearby, Jenna invited him over to help each other with their homework. At around midnight, Spencer said goodbye to Jenna and went home. About half an hour after that, they briefly talked on the phone, after which they wished each other good night and went to sleep. On the morning of April 9th, Spencer discovered that he had left his textbook at Jenna's place, which he needed for a lecture. Around 11:30 a.m., he went to her house to retrieve it. When no one answered the door, Spencer was surprised to find that it was unlocked. Thinking that Jenna was still asleep, he walked into her apartment and headed to her bedroom. However, he was met with a horrifying sight. Jenna was lying lifeless on the floor. Realizing that she was dead, Spencer immediately ran to the neighboring apartment and asked the residents to call the police. The recording of this call is publicly available. Jenna's neighbor informed the operator that she was lying on the floor not breathing, and Spencer's shocked voice could be heard in the background. The arriving police officers examined the apartment and found no signs of forced entry. The only strange thing was that the window in the second bedroom was open. Detectives immediately speculated that the killer may have entered the premises through it, but this theory was questioned due to the unlocked door. Investigators immediately doubted the theory of a possible robbery, which could have led the perpetrator to attack Jenna, as all her things were in their place. Nothing valuable was missing, and her purse with money and credit cards was hanging right by the front door, which a thief would have undoubtedly taken. Furthermore, there was complete order in the apartment. No signs of struggle were observed. At first glance, there was no evidence pointing to the killer's recent presence. Examining Jana's body, the police did not notice any serious injuries, except for a bruise on her forehead and a bitten lip. She was lying on her back, fully dressed, and the position of her body looked entirely natural. Small blood droplets were visible on her shirt collar and on the carpet near her body. After studying the body, medical experts made several important conclusions. Firstly, death occurred about 10 hours before Spencer found Jenna, meaning she was killed just an hour after she finished talking to him on the phone. Secondly, traces of strangulation were found on her body, which was the cause of death. The experts also determined that the unknown perpetrator did not sexually assault the young woman. However, Jenna tried to fight him off, as evidenced by skin and blood under her fingernails. All of these samples were immediately sent to the laboratory to try to extract a DNA sample of the perpetrator. Of course, her boyfriend, Spencer, became the first suspect for several reasons. Firstly, statistically speaking, murderers often turn out to be someone close to the victim. Secondly, the absence of any signs of forced entry indicated that Jenna may have known the perpetrator and willingly let them into the apartment. During questioning, Spencer cooperated with the investigation and answered all questions. At that time, however, experts had not yet managed to extract the DNA sample from the killer. Therefore, the police could not verify Spencer's involvement in the murder. Eventually, he was released, but investigators did not rush to clear him of suspicion. Meanwhile, Jenna's friends said that he cherished her deeply and was unlikely to have caused any harm to his beloved. Next, detectives began searching for possible witnesses. The police questioned Jenna's neighbors to find out if they had noticed anything suspicious on the night of the murder. They soon found several guys who were playing volleyball near Jenna's apartment complex at that time. They reported seeing a strange guy who came out of the building near the young woman's apartment. They were surprised that this person was only wearing pants. The witnesses added that the guy looked like 26 years old, Sean Stevens, who lived in the same apartment complex. Upon learning of this, Jenna's friends told the police about another troubling fact. Some time ago, Stevens, who lived right across from Jenna, shouted insults at her from his window. It was not entirely clear what was behind his behavior, but for the police, all of these facts were enough to suspect the young man. Stevens was found and questioned. He claimed to know nothing about the murder and that he did not leave his apartment complex that night, let alone walk around without clothes. The police had no way to confirm his words, but without any serious evidence, he had to be released as well. In addition to everything else, the detectives studied the possible connection of this murder to Jenna's workplace. However, her colleagues from the restaurant and the surveillance cameras showed that on the day of her death, she did not have any conflicts with anyone, and such situations had never arisen before. From this point on, the investigation slowed down. The police continued to search for new leads, questioning Jenna's relatives and friends, and at some point, they were able to get a new lead. During a conversation with investigators, the young woman's parents were able to recall important information that could potentially point to another suspect. 2 months before Jenna's murder, she complained to her relatives about a repairman who was doing maintenance work in her apartment complex building.
One day, when she came out of the shower in just a towel, she discovered a stranger in her living room. When she asked him what he was doing in her apartment, he replied that he thought no one was home. The man claimed that he did not hear the running shower and stayed to check the condition of the apartment and make sure nothing needed repair. Of course, Jenna was shocked by such a situation. She found out that the man was 29-year-old Jeremiah Rosser and reported the incident to the building manager. The police conducted a small experiment. One person stood at the entrance door and the other turned down the shower. The sound of running water was very well heard in the living room and even near the entrance door. In such a situation, it was highly unlikely that Rosser did not hear it and thought that no one was home. After talking to the building manager, the police found out that Rosser stopped coming to work a few days after Jenna's murder. This was the reason for his dismissal. All of this looked very suspicious, and the detectives tried to find the man. But here they faced one problem. Rosser moved out of his apartment, and they could not determine his current location. The police only managed to find out that he has an ex-wife and 2 children. Thus, in this complicated case, there were 3 main suspects: Spencer Hood, Sean Stevens, and Jeremiah Rosser. To determine if one of them was the killer, they had to wait for the results from the lab, where experts were trying to extract a DNA sample. They were working on studying the particles under the young woman's nails and drops of blood on her shirt and rug. As a result, they found out that one of the drops of blood on the rug contained genetic material that did not belong to Jenna. This sample matched the one extracted from the particles under the young woman's nails. In the end, the experts were finally able to extract a full DNA sample. The first thing they did was enter it into the FBI database, but there were no matches. This meant that the killer had not previously been convicted of any serious crimes. Despite this, the police were now able to match the obtained sample with DNA samples from 3 main suspects. The problem was only that their samples were not taken during the initial interrogations. Detectives tried to contact them and were surprised to find out that all 3 had left town and their current location was unknown. The police immediately began searching for them. Meanwhile, investigators decided not to sit idly by and use the killer's DNA sample. They began voluntarily collecting DNA samples from men who lived in the same complex as Jenna and worked in her restaurant. In total, they managed to obtain 50 DNA samples, but none of them matched the one found at the murder scene. Meanwhile, the police finally managed to find Spencer, who turned out to be 3 hours' drive from Brian at his parents' house. The young man explained that he could not cope with Jenna's death and decided to spend time with his family to distract himself from this tragedy. He voluntarily provided his DNA sample, which was immediately sent to the laboratory. The young man also allowed experts to examine his body for scratches that would undoubtedly be on the killer. After all, his pieces of skin were found under Jenna's nails. Following this, the police managed to establish Stephen's location, who also went to visit his parents, who lived 720 kilometers from Blinn College. He voluntarily provided his DNA sample, which was also sent to the laboratory. While the police were waiting for the results from the laboratory, they had to find the last suspect. This turned out to be much more difficult. The police managed to contact Rosser's ex-wife, who shared some troubling facts. According to her, when their marriage was nearing divorce, Rosser was behaving aggressively towards her. He raised his hand to her, knocked her down, and tried to strangle her. In addition, he often caused scandals, which made it impossible to live with him, and the marriage ended in divorce. All of this happened around the same time that Jenna was killed. Thanks to his ex-wife, the police were able to locate Rosser.
This happened in early October, 7 months after the murder. During the interrogation, he behaved quite calmly, answering all the detectives' questions. Additionally, the man had never been arrested in his life. He denied his involvement in the murder and voluntarily provided his DNA sample. The police also searched his car and found some interesting discoveries. A laptop was found in the car, whose serial number was listed in the theft report. A few months before Jenna's murder, her neighbor contacted the police after her laptop disappeared from her apartment. But that wasn't the worst part. The police also found keys to several apartments in the residential complex where he worked. Considering that he was fired a week after Jenna's murder, Rosser had no right to keep the keys, and the manager was obliged to confiscate them. All of this indicated that the man was engaged in petty theft. But could he move on to cold-blooded murder? Meanwhile, experts from the laboratory tested all 3 DNA samples. It turned out that Jenna's boyfriend and her neighbor had nothing to do with the murder. But Rosser's DNA sample matched the sample found under the victim's nails. Upon receiving the results, the police immediately arrested Rosser, but despite the DNA match, he continued to insist on his innocence. Of course, this did not help him in any way, and the man was charged with Jenna's murder. Since Rosser was not eager to disclose the details of that night, the investigators came up with their own version of what happened. Apparently, Rosser broke into Jenna's apartment with the intention of committing robbery, using a key to her door. This could have happened in the evening before 9 p.m. when the young woman had not yet returned home from work. Perhaps Rosser did not have time to commit the intended crime because Jenna came home with her boyfriend, and the criminal had to hide in the second bedroom, where he waited for Spencer to leave. It is possible that it was Rosser who opened the window, hoping to quietly leave the apartment through it, but it did not work out for him. After waiting for Spencer to leave and hearing Jenna wishing him good night over the phone, Rosser could finally try to leave the apartment through the front door. There are 2 possible scenarios for what happened next. Either he tried to leave the apartment, but Jenna noticed him first and in a panic, he attacked her, or he intentionally went to her room planning to commit murder. The police even suggested that he killed the young woman because she resembled his ex-wife. Considering that the man refused to admit his guilt, the case was taken to court. The wait for the trial to begin dragged on for many months, as is often the case in the state's legal system. However, just 2 weeks before the trial was set to begin, something unexpected happened. In December 2009, more than a year after his arrest, Rosser finally admitted his guilt. He entered into a plea agreement with the prosecutor in the hope of reducing his sentence. The man also asked the investigation not to involve his family in the legal process. His parents and 2 children from his ex-wife were among them. Thanks to this, the trial was completed in record time. If he had not admitted guilt, the trial could easily have dragged on for several years, despite the DNA sample match. As a result, Rosser was sentenced to 55 years in prison. In addition, he received 5 years in prison for the theft of a laptop. The assistant district attorney said that, to his memory, this was the maximum sentence in the case of a guilty plea. However, Rosser had a much more serious risk, the death penalty. If the investigation had been able to prove that the murder was premeditated and planned, Rosser could have received this sentence. The man was placed in Rasharon Prison in Texas. He will be eligible for parole only in 2036. Given that Rosser was 27 at the time of the crime, he may be released early at the age of 55. However, if he serves his full sentence, he will only be released at the age of 82. During the trial, he refused to look his relatives and friends of Jenna in the eye. He was led into the courtroom in an orange prison jumpsuit, handcuffed. The man only nodded to his parents in greeting when he saw them in the courtroom. Otherwise, he remained silent and unresponsive with his head bowed. The victim's family had the right to speak in court, addressing the murderer directly. All three of them took advantage of this opportunity. Diana's sister stood in the court 60 centimeters away from the perpetrator, saying she hoped Rosser would come to realize the terrible act he had committed. She promised to pray for him and believed that she would someday be able to forgive her sister's killer. Jenna's mother expressed doubt that Rosser regretted his actions. She made the killer look her straight in the eye and said with firm conviction that he would never be able to fully understand the horror he had inflicted on their family. The father of Jenna did not plan to speak at the trial, but changed his mind at the last moment. He promised to come to any prison where Rosser is placed and tell everyone what a monster he is. He also expressed willingness to attend the hearing in 27 years when Rosser requests parole. In addition, Jenna's parents filed a lawsuit against the owner of the residential complex. They were sure that their daughter's words were not taken seriously when she complained to Rosser's supervisor about his behavior. Moreover, Rosser's keys were not confiscated after his dismissal, indicating the manager's negligence. Jenna's parents believed that their daughter would still be alive if her complaints had been taken seriously and attention had been paid to Rosser's inappropriate behavior. The only thing that remains unclear to this day is Rosser's exact motives. Despite confessing to the murder, he refused to reveal the reasons for his actions. In any case, it doesn't matter anymore. His guilt is evident, and he deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison. Pamela Dorrington was born in November 23, 1948, in the small American town of Helena, Montana. She grew up in a close-knit family and had many friends. Her acquaintances noted that the girl from an early age was responsible and could always come to their aid. Pamela also loved animals, and her parents bought her a black Labrador. She did well in the local school, and in high school she was passionate about learning the Russian language. After high school, the young woman took a job as a surgical nurse at St. Peter's Hospital in her hometown. Although her parents' home was relatively close to work, Pamela sought to establish an independent life. For this reason, she moved out of her parents' house and moved into a rented apartment with her cousin Mary, who worked at the same hospital. The young women rented a 2-bedroom apartment on the second floor of an apartment complex. Early in the morning on February 17, 1968, Mary went to work at the hospital. Pamela was still asleep, since she had to go out for the evening shift that day. The Labrador also slept in her room. A few hours after Mary left for work, Pamela's father drove by their apartment complex. Near the building, he noticed his daughter's Labrador running around without a leash. The week before, the dog had broken loose and run away from its owner, and Pamela had to pick it up from the local shelter. So what he saw didn't surprise the man. He knocked on the door of their apartment, but there was no answer. Thinking his daughter had gone to work, he took the dog and left. At 3 p.m., Pamela was supposed to go to work, but she never showed up at the hospital. Her cousin tried to call the home phone at their apartment, but there was no answer. When she got home, Pamela wasn't there, and Mary and her parents began to get seriously worried. Pamela was a very responsible person and would never miss her shift without a good reason, especially without notifying management. Besides, if the young woman was going somewhere, she would certainly tell her parents and sister. Another cause for concern was the fact that Pamela's car was parked in the parking lot of the apartment complex. This fact also made it less likely that the young woman had gone somewhere on foot all day. The relatives waited until the next morning and contacted the police. They took a missing persons report, but were in no hurry to start a search. Pamela was 19 years old, and investigators did not rule out that she left home of her own free will. After inspecting her apartment, detectives found no signs of forced entry or a struggle. Everything looked routine. They asked her sister to look through Pamela's things and tell her if everything was there. Mary noticed that her coat, terry cloth robe, purse, and winter boots were missing from their apartment. 2 days after Pamela's disappearance, police organized a search operation within a 30-kilometer radius of her home. They searched fields, forests, and bodies of water, while volunteers and the young woman's relatives handed out flyers on the city streets. Patrolmen interviewed Pamela's neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances. None of them had seen the young woman the day she disappeared and had no idea where she might have gone. Her supervisor at the hospital said Pamela was supposed to pick up a check for $200 that day, but never showed up. This further indicated that the young woman was unlikely to have run off somewhere, leaving behind the money she had earned. In the first days of the search, police interviewed more than 100 people who had anything to do with Pamela. Some of them were interrogated by polygraph, but it yielded no results. Investigators were also unable to find any evidence that the young woman might have left town. With no leads on their hands, the police concentrated all their efforts on the search operation. They expanded the area to about 50 kilometers around the city and brought in additional forces. Because many parts of the area were not easily accessible to pedestrians and cars, the search involved many officers on horseback. Speaking to reporters, the sheriff said that this was the most effective, as a person on horseback could see better and an animal can smell a dead body and demonstrate this behavior. The search continued for a month, but was inconclusive, and eventually the sheriff decided to suspend the search operation. Since then, the case has essentially come to a standstill, as the detectives have had no leads on their hands. In April, 2 months after Pamela disappeared, something unusual happened. A patrolman in Great Falls, a town about 140 kilometers from Helena, stopped a car for speeding. He issued a warning to the woman behind the wheel and let her go. Later, as he was writing the report at the station, his colleagues noticed one odd thing. The driver's license the woman showed the officer was issued in the name of Pamela Dorrington. The Helena detectives asked for a description of the woman's appearance, and from what he said, it looked very much like she was the one behind the wheel. This news gave new hope to the relatives of the missing young woman, except that investigators never managed to find the car and its driver. On June 13th of that year, nearly 4 months after Pamela's disappearance, the sheriff's office received a call. A national park ranger, just a few miles from Helena, was walking near the docks at the lake and noticed a human body in the water. Police officers arrived on the scene and extracted a human torso, about waist to knee, from the water. It was turned over to experts who proceeded to examine it and determined that it belonged to a woman about 17 to 23 years old. Detectives almost immediately made the assumption that the deceased was Pamela Dorrington. Along with it, they found several items of clothing that were similar to items from Pamela's closet. They showed them to her sister and parents, and they confirmed that Pamela did have something similar. Medical examiners found several stab wounds on it and signs that the young woman had been abused, but the torso alone could not be identified. All of this was before DNA testing was available. The only thing the experts could surmise was the approximate time the body had been in the water. In their opinion, it could have been there for about 4 months, which coincided with the time of Pamela's disappearance. In the weeks that followed, investigators, along with divers, searched the lake and the adjacent Missouri River, trying to find missing body parts, but it was inconclusive. Despite failing to identify the deceased, the sheriff told reporters that the body was very likely Pamela's, so police were no longer investigating a missing person, but a murder. However, this discovery did not bring them any closer to the perpetrator himself, as there were still no leads. Since then, there has been no progress in the case. Police told reporters and Pamela's family that they had had several suspects, but it was impossible to determine their involvement without any evidence. A year after the murder, the sheriff contacted a psychologist in Detroit who specialized in particularly violent crimes. From the information available, he concluded that the perpetrator was a psychopath with twisted desires, which was the motive for the murder. Given this, it is unlikely that he could have stopped at one murder, and detectives should expect more similar episodes. At the same time, the expert suggested that this man was capable of easily hiding his true face and leading an ordinary lifestyle. All this information did not help the sheriff much, but no other threads of the investigation he no longer saw. The man gave the psychologist the names of his suspects and asked him to assess which of them could commit such a crime. But the expert could not draw such conclusions without additional evidence. Pamela was not buried until 7 years after the murder, on June 14, 1975. In all that time, investigators never found her other remains, nor did they come any closer to catching the perpetrator. Nevertheless, they continued to consider all sorts of possibilities. Once the detectives even turned to clairvoyance, but the result was quite expected. 15 years after the 1983 murder, something interesting happened. The landlord of the apartment Pamela and Mary had rented was found guilty of murdering his wife. In 1968, a man named Brooke Atlas lived on the first floor, directly below their apartment. He had been on the list of possible suspects since the early days, but a complete lack of evidence prevented any conclusions about his involvement. He later married and moved into a private home with his wife. In 1983, their home burned down, and experts were quick to determine that it was arson. Moreover, the body of Atlas's wife was found in the house, but the cause of her death was not fire. The pathologist determined that she had been killed by strangulation. Investigators assumed that the man decided to get rid of his wife and house because of financial problems. Shortly before, he had declared bankruptcy, and the loss of his insured home could have resulted in a hefty payout from the insurance company. But instead, he received a life sentence for murder without parole and an additional 20 years for arson. Investigators in Pamela's case were interested in this episode. Atlas, who lived literally a foot away from the victim, had the opportunity to kill her. The man could have used a spare key, and over the months of living near the young woman, he may have well learned their work schedules. Detectives talked to Atlas, but he denied all allegations. Given that there was not a single piece of evidence against him, the cops had no choice but to accept it and hope that sooner or later, new leads would emerge in the case. In the 38 years that followed, no progress was made. Pamela's parents passed away without learning the truth, and of her closest relatives, she had only a younger brother. He had given up hope of finding out what had happened to his sister. But in 2021, the case was given another chance. It was turned over to the Unsolved Homicide Squad, and the new detectives decided to reopen the investigation. Pamela's murder was not typical of such units. They usually reopened old cases where the perpetrator left his DNA behind. But because of the lack of analytical tools in those years, it was impossible to use that to catch the killer. In Pamela's case, there was no evidence at all, and the detectives could only hope for luck. They studied all the materials left by their predecessors, including a list of possible suspects. Brooke Atlas stood out clearly, since he had already been imprisoned for the murder of his wife. The man was 79 years old at the time and was still serving his sentence. Investigators realized that proving his guilt after 53 years would be very difficult, and the man was unlikely to live to see sentencing. Not only could the trial drag on for years without a single piece of evidence, but no judge would even consider such a case. So the detectives decided to take a very unusual approach to the matter. They went to Atlas in prison and offered him a confession to Pamela's murder. In exchange, They guaranteed him that he would receive no additional punishment for it. Such moves on the part of law enforcement are quite rare, especially when it comes to a brutal murder. But in this particular case, they knew they had only two options: wait until they got their hands on some new evidence, which was highly unlikely, or get a confession. And given Alice's age, the second option could disappear at any moment. Besides, Pamela's only living close relative was her brother, who was also of advanced age. The detectives wanted him to know the truth, told him about the possibility of such a deal, and the man agreed. The investigators brought their offer to Atlas and waited. To their surprise, it worked. The perpetrator said he was ready to confess, but the detectives were in no hurry to rejoice. They needed to make sure that the man was really involved in the murder, rather than taking the blame for someone else's crime. They spent many hours questioning him about the details of the murder, Atlas confessing that he had planned Pamela's murder in advance. After waiting for her sister to go to work, he went up to their apartment and rang the bell. When Pamela opened the door, he told her there was a leak in one of the pipes in her apartment and urgent repairs needed to be made. Pamela let the man in without a shadow of a doubt. Once in the apartment, he attacked her and strangled her, then took her body back to his apartment and abused her. This was the main motive for what he did. Atlas then placed her in a barrel and took her to the warehouse of the small airport where he worked as a flight instructor. That very day, a few hours after the murder, the man was quietly conducting a few lessons with his students. The barrel stood in the warehouse for several days, after which Atlas took it to the banks of the Missouri River, separated the body, and dumped it in the water. In addition, the man told police several facts that were never divulged, so only the killer could know them. With all this information in hand, the detectives had no doubt that Atlas was telling the truth. 53 years later, they finally succeeded in solving the case, though they had to guarantee the murderer full immunity. Remarkably, the murderer decided to accept the deal for a reason. He said that during his imprisonment, he believed in God and began to feel remorse and apologized to Pamela's relatives for what he had done. The Detroit psychologist's analysis turned out to be quite accurate. Atlas really seemed a decent man. For a long time, he had worked as a heavy equipment operator. Then he began teaching flight lessons, started a family. Only after the murder of his wife, his true nature became clear. The victim's brother thanked the investigators for bringing the case to an end. The man understood that a conviction and an additional life sentence for Atlas wouldn't have changed anything. And thanks to the detectives, the case was over. Alice Ruggles was born on December 24, 1991, exactly one day before Christmas. Her parents, Sue Hills and Clive Ruggles, already had 2 children, and later another boy was born in the family. They lived in the tiny English village of Torlangton, located in Lancashire County. The family was very close-knit, and the older children always took care of Alice and her younger brother. In the local school, the girl started attending a drama club and quickly fell in love with acting. She participated in many theatrical productions, and all her teachers noted her natural talent. After graduating from high school, at the age of 18, Alice enrolled in Northumbria University, where she studied design. After receiving her diploma in 2014, she moved to a city called Gateshead and got a job at the major British media company Sky. Alice rented an apartment with her roommates because it was difficult for her to afford separate housing at first. In October 2015, when the young woman was 23, she met a man named Harry Dillon. He stumbled upon her account on Facebook through a mutual friends page. They started talking and soon became fond of each other. Harry was from India and came to Great Britain through a student program. He transferred from a local Indian university to Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh. After completing his studies, he decided to stay in England and join the army. After some time, he was sent to Afghanistan, where he started communicating with Alice on Facebook. At first, they just exchanged messages, then began calling each other several times a week, and eventually started a relationship. They eagerly awaited the moment when Harry would return to Great Britain to finally meet. When it happened, they went on several dates, and Harry made a good impression on Alice. They had a great time, and the mutual attraction between them only grew stronger. However, after a few weeks, they had to separate again. Harry had to go back to Afghanistan for 2 more months, after which they planned to continue their relationship. The couple continued to communicate online until Harry finally returned to England in April. He lived in a military base in Edinburgh, which was almost 200 kilometers away from the city where Alice lived, but Harry tried to visit her whenever he could. Months after Harry's return to England, Alice invited him to a family celebration, and it seemed like their relationship was getting stronger. But over time, acquaintances began to notice significant changes in her behavior. Previously, she was always cheerful, sociable, and positive, but something was changing in her every day. Alice became withdrawn, depressed, and stopped spending time with friends. She even stopped communicating with them in social media, and no one could understand what was happening to her. Alice became more irritable, and at one point, she had a fight with her apartment neighbors. She packed her things and moved to her colleague's apartment. Alice's family and friends began to suspect that her new boyfriend Harry was the cause of these significant changes. At first, she was reluctant to share her relationship problems, but it became impossible to hide them over time. It turned out that Harry was not the kind and caring man he was in the first months after they met. The longer their relationship lasted, the more he tried to control every aspect of Alice's life. Harry was against her hanging out with friends or talking to other men, even if they were her old acquaintances or work colleagues. He began to monitor her social media conversations and constantly accused her of wanting to cheat on him. Every time she talked to friends or planned to go out with them, Harry would throw a tantrum. But what was even more interesting, Harry began openly cheating on Alice, meeting women from Tinder for one-night stands without any commitment. After that, he often talked about these women to Alice to make her jealous. It even got to the point where one of these women wrote to Alice on social media in August. At that moment, the young woman decided to break up with Harry, but he didn't want to let her go. He bombarded Alice with messages and calls, trying to get her back by any means necessary. At first, he said that he loved her, cried on the phone, and promised to change for the better. Then he began openly manipulating the young woman, promising to take his own life and blaming her for everything. It even got to direct threats. It turned out that Harry had secretly taken pictures of Alice while she was changing clothes, and he threatened to post these pictures on the internet if she didn't come back to him. In the end, Alice decided to simply ignore him. And then Harry changed tactics. He started calling her friends and relatives, asking them to reason with the young woman. Realizing that this also didn't work, he began writing her letters with poems about his love for her. However, soon he once again resorted to threats and blackmail. But Alice still didn't respond to these letters. Later, it turned out that Harry had managed to hack her Facebook account and was monitoring her correspondence. From there, he found out that since September, Alice had started communicating with a man named Mike, who was an army officer and was in another country at the time. Harry was furious. He began writing to Mike that Alice was still in love with him and sleeping with him, and also wrote various nasty things about her. But by that time, Mike already knew about Harry and didn't pay any attention to his words. He continued his relationship with Alice, and it seemed that the young woman had managed to get out of this whole situation with Harry. She became sociable, cheerful, and happy again. But unfortunately, this didn't last long. On September 30th, Harry left her a voice message begging her to pick up the phone. Alice ignored him, and then he decided to go to her house. The man drove 2.5 hours from his military base to her apartment, but then he behaved quite strangely. First, he rang the doorbell and ran away. Alice was at home, but she didn't open the door because she didn't see anyone through the peephole. The situation repeated several times. Then, a few hours later, Harry climbed over the fence and approached the window of her bedroom. Alice lived on the first floor of a 2-story house with a fenced area. Harry knocked on the window and hid, leaving a box of candy and a bouquet on the windowsill. What happened greatly frightened Alice. She immediately understood that Harry was behind all of it. Additionally, when she approached the window, she briefly saw a man hiding outside her field of view. But that wasn't all. While hiding in her yard, Harry recorded several creepy voice messages, the content of which caused Alice real panic. One of them began with the words, "You said guys like me end up killing people." After these words, he began repeating multiple times that he didn't want to kill her. From his voice, Alice felt like he was primarily trying to convince himself of what he said. Finally, he wished her good night and left. All of this was already enough for Alice to contact the police. After what happened, she began to seriously fear for her life and didn't know how else to protect herself from Harry. The operator offered her 2 options for solving the problem. She could obtain a restraining order against Harry or ask the police to issue an official police information notice, known in Great Britain as a PIN, and allowed the police to arrest the man if he approached or contacted Alice. The young woman chose the latter option. The next day, the police came to her, took a statement, and assured her that Harry would face the consequences if he bothered her again. After some time, the police called the military unit and informed the commanding officer about the measures taken against Harry. Interestingly, the police did not contact him personally, even by phone, let alone a personal visit, although they were obliged to do so by law. Learning that Alice had contacted the police, he became angry and wrote her another letter, along with a box of items that reminded him of her. In the letter, he said that because of her complaint, his phone, tablet, and laptop were taken away from him. He also promised not to bother her again. But Alice knew for sure he wouldn't just calm down like that. When she first contacted the police, they told her to call them immediately if Harry contacted her again, so she did. She told the operator about the letter and the box of items, but he didn't know what action to take in this case. Moreover, he asked Alice herself what actions she expected from them. In the end, he promised her that another officer would call her back. Of course, this response from the police shocked Alice, and she had no idea what to do next. Several hours later, an officer did call her back and listened to her entire story. He then asked if she wanted the police to arrest Harry, and here Alice made a fatal mistake. She felt sorry for him and answered negatively. However, even if he had been arrested, Harry would not have received any punishment. He would have been held for some time in the station and released. After this, Alice realized that the police could not help her in the situation that had arisen, so she was left to rely only on herself. On October 12th, 5 days after she went to the police, Alice remained depressed and frightened. She hoped to distract herself from these troubling thoughts over the weekend. Mike was supposed to come see her, and they planned to spend the next few days together. That evening, Alice returned home from work, and her neighbor was not home. She began to prepare for bed while chatting with Mike about their upcoming meeting, but she did not know that Harry had been standing in the courtyard of her building and watching her. Taking advantage of the fact that Alice had left the window slightly open, he climbed into her bedroom and went to the kitchen, where he took a knife and went to the bathroom where Alice was. The events that followed unfolded rapidly. Harry struck her 24 times with the knife, causing Alice to die almost instantly. After that, he left the apartment, got into his car, and drove back to his military unit. In less than an hour, Alice's neighbor returned home and found that the front door was locked from the inside. She knocked several times, hoping Alice would answer, but she did not. Then the neighbor went to the backyard to knock on the window of Alice's bedroom, but what she saw shocked her. Through the open window, she saw Alice laying on the bathroom floor in a pool of blood. She immediately called the police in a panic and told them what had happened, adding, "We knew this was going to happen. Her ex is a real psychopath." Less than 2 minutes later, the neighbor heard police sirens approaching, and with them came paramedics who confirmed Alice's death. It became immediately obvious to them that the conversation was about a murder, in connection with the fact that the neighbor named Harry Dillon as a potential killer. The police immediately began to search for him. After running the numbers of his car, they found that the man had driven from Edinburgh to Newcastle that day. His car appeared on several surveillance cameras. Just a few hours later, the police arrived at the military base and arrested Harry. They took him to the station and began to interrogate him. The man admitted that he had gone to see Alice, but denied any involvement in the murder. According to him, he came to talk to her, and she allegedly came out onto the street and hit him in the face during the conversation. After that, Harry allegedly got into his car and drove back to the base, but detectives quickly found out that his story had nothing to do with reality. From the surveillance cameras, they learned that Harry had arrived at Alice's house even before she returned from work. He parked his car and waited. But that's not all. Investigators examined his phone and found that while Harry was sitting in the car, he was messaging with a random girl on Tinder and arranging to meet her that same night. Detectives also found bloodstains on the steering wheel of Harry's car, and analysis showed that this blood belonged to Alice. Moreover, the man stole her phone and took it with him, which is why the geolocation of the device completely matched the movements of the killer that day. All of this was enough to bring charges of murder and send the case to court. However, the first hearing took place only almost a year later, in April 2017. Harry's lawyers realized that with such a set of evidence against their client, they needed to come up with a new story. As a result, the man claimed that he had actually come to Alice's house to collect his things, but they had an argument, and then Alice allegedly took a knife and attacked him, accidentally inflicting 24 wounds on herself. After that, he watched her die and even heard her last words. She allegedly said that she hated her family. Of course, this delusional story was not taken seriously. Moreover, during the court hearings, another gruesome fact emerged. Before the murder, Harry had visited Alice's house several times, sneaked into the backyard, and took pictures. According to the prosecution, he carefully planned the murder in advance. 11 days later, the court handed down a guilty verdict: life imprisonment with the possibility of applying for parole in 22 years. During a reading of the verdict, the judge noted that Harry showed no remorse or compassion. Instead, he was focused only on inventing the most plausible story. Another horrific detail from Harry's past came to light during the trial. 3 years before these events, his ex-girlfriend obtained a restraining order against him because he was stalking her in the same way he would later stalk Alice, but the police simply did not know about it. After the murder, society and the media harshly criticized the police, accusing them of failing to protect Alice from a dangerous psychopath, letting the case go unchecked. Later, 2 officers were disciplined. The army also came under fire. The public was outraged that such an unbalanced and dangerous person was allowed to join. In addition, no action was taken against Harry when the PIN was issued against him. Sometime later, Alice's family launched a foundation named in her honor. Its goal was to work towards ensuring the victims of stalking receive immediate and proper assistance from the police. Alice's case showed that law enforcement agencies simply cannot provide such protection, so legislative changes are needed. In 2019, a law was passed that simplifies the issuance of restraining orders against people who stalk their victims. However, Alice's family continues to work on the foundation and hopes that it will help change the situation in the country for the better. Now, all her relatives and acquaintances believe that this tragedy could have been avoided if the police had taken their duties more seriously.